des limites. On a vu que les limites étaient complexes et nombreuses. Et je vous propose de commencer ce matin avec quelques mots de présentation que j'ai trouvé très plaisants. Le titre de l'intervention du président de Fondation Global Value Alliance, Klaus Hessinger, c'est « De bons mots, c'est bien, mais ce sont les poules qui pondent les œufs ». Je trouve que c'est très plaisant comme mode de présentation. Cher monsieur, si vous voulez bien me rejoindre. Bienvenue à vous et merci pour votre intervention. Et je vous demanderai ensuite d'ailleurs de bien vouloir venir vous installer ici avec moi et nous partagerons ensuite une table ronde avec le professeur Naron. Je vous en prie.
Yes, good morning. Morning everyone. Can I have the presentation up there, please? I love technical problems. Yes, it's early in the morning, and yet, press the right button and the presentation will be there. Good. So we have been talking about most of the things that I'm going to talk this morning and just try to bring them together in a more social science and political science manner. Despite the many years of economic growth in most parts of the world, still more than 700 million people were afflicted by hunger in 2019. It increased due to the COVID pandemic to more than 800 million, and we have new clusters, and I will talk about that. I prepared the first version of this presentation about 3 weeks ago, and I was not nightmare of the possibility that you would have a war. But now, we even have to look at Russia's attack on Ukraine, which is likely to have a negative impact on agricultural supply chains. According to the Department of Agriculture of the United States, Ukraine produced a historical high of 42 million tons of corn in 21. And even if they would do the same amount of production, which is unlikely, the logistics would be not the same as last year. Ukraine also produces 50% of the world's sunflower seed oil, and alongside with Russia, 50% of the cereal needs for North Africa and the Middle East. And this is likely to trigger unrest, and unrest is likely to have all solutions put more difficult. I am talking about lack of food security. Hunger is only the worst expression of a larger and much more comprehensive problem, which is lack of regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development and an active and healthy life. It develops as a consequence of a great number of interrelated economic, social, political, cultural, and ecological problems. And it's this that I'm going to put into the nucleus of my talk. It's the interrelations of many things. So monocausal approaches will not make a lot of sense. Food security ought to be regarded as a subsistence of the social system of poverty, and this kind of social system has the unfortunate effect that a change in one condition will cause changes in others and create cumulative change for the better, or, as we can also see, for the worse. The facts are also known with regard to lack of food security. It's about 3 billion people, and that's most important. Over the past 3 years, and not only due to the Ukraine crisis, the fight against hunger is slipping off, dangerously off track. It remains a serious, alarming, and extremely alarming in nearly 50 countries. Global progress is slower as the rates of hunger remain stubbornly high in some regions. The fight against hunger in Africa is likely to receive less attention in the light of the ongoing war brutality in Ukraine. My experience has been people are mainly concentrating on one problem, or maybe on two, and all the rest goes on the back burner, so to say. Until recently, the fate of the Afghan women was a big issue in the German discussion, in the Swiss discussion. Today, nobody talks about that. It's all Ukraine and the issues that go with this. And another political one, you might have seen that 17 countries abstained in the vote on the United Nations resolution condemning the invasion and calling for immediate withdrawal of the Russian forces. And this will have a negative effect on the willingness of European countries to increase resources to fight poverty in these countries. I'm not going to bore you with all the details here on this graph. What I want to say, the World Economic Forum is looking at the complexity of issues. And the complexity of of attaining the zero hunger global development gain are huge. And together we could discuss a week and go through all the different aspects here. Trade and development, environmental footprint. I learned from my friend Daniel Nahon that the microparticles that go up through the slash and burn agriculture in Africa have a massive impact on the climate, as massive as all the the traffic. Chemical inputs will have an impact. Using more water will have an impact. And I'm not going through all of that, but eventually my thesis is also you cannot solve a complex problem with monocausal approaches. And therefore, we talked yesterday about interdisciplinarity. The economists will propose a different solution than the agronomists, the geologists, the meteorologists, all of them in their silos have their specificities of knowledge. Only if we bring them all together to a table can we really hope to have sustainable solutions. So the facts are known, but as many times, I'm usually talking about corporate responsibilities, business and human rights, and if you diagnose the problem, that's only one step. You have to diagnose the drivers behind the problem, what is creating the problem. Because if you do not go out after the drivers, you can solve a problem momentarily, and then if you go back to square one, the same drivers will again create the same problem. So the drivers of lack of food security are poverty, are inequality, are economic slowdowns, and downturns, and COVID was one factor. The Russian war will be another factor. That's behind the rises in hunger, and that's behind slowing progress in reduces all form of malnutrition and say all form of poverty. Conflict negatively affects almost every aspect of the food system, from production, harvesting, processing, and transport to input, supplies, financing, marketing, and consumption. So what we are having now at the moment is a major impact on a deterioration of the situation. Climate variability and extremes create multiple and compounding impacts on food systems. They negatively affect agricultural productivity and also affect food imports as countries try to compensate for domestic production losses. And again, those who have the purchasing power have a smaller problem than those who do not have purchasing power if you go for international markets. Lack of governance. I'm always pounding the factor that you need participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, and effective, as well as rules of law as good governance in a country. Where you do not have that, you should not be surprised if you have all kinds of problems, inclusive lack of food security. These major drivers are unique, but they are not mutually exclusive. They interact to the detriment of food security and nutrition by creating multiple compounding impacts at many different points within the food system. And you know, again, we could talk a whole week on impact and interdependence of various drivers, because again, what we discussed partly yesterday, you can approach one problem and think you can solve it, let's say through the economics view, and you create another problem, and as many times, and in many respects, it's not the decision between black and white, good and bad. It is you look at this kind of solution and you have these risks and you have these benefits, and you look at that solution, you have other risks and other benefits, and what you ought to do is balancing the risk-benefit ratios, and that's a difficult thing because it becomes political. The moment you have evaluations involved, you have all kinds of political impacts, and that's not always to the best. Now, we know the facts, we know the drivers, and by the way, we know the policies. And you know, when I prepared for this lecture, I went back and I found in 1996, I had the privilege of attending the World Food Summit in Rome. If you read, and I all encourage you to do that, if you go back and read the Rome Declaration on Food Security, it is all there. There is not one additional issue standing in the way of better food security that is not already mentioned here. So nobody can tell us we do not know what to do. We know very well what to do. And of course, you know, I've been working 25 years with the United Nations. The problem with United Nations declarations is that they are on an abstract level so that everybody can agree. The disadvantage is everybody goes home and interprets this abstract level in a different way. So you have a pseudo consensus. If it comes to practical action, it's different. But we also here, we pledge our political will and our common national commitment to achieving food security for all and to an ongoing effort to eradicate hunger in all countries. We have doubled up with the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, where we say, leaving no one behind. We have been committed to leave no one behind. And by the way, what are the 800 million people who are hungry? They are left behind, and what are we going to do about that? Now, if you look at the policy elements, they are all mentioned in this Food Summit Declaration. It's poverty, and a lot of the poverty actions, a lot of poverty policy automatically has a positive impact on food security and on the alleviation of hunger. Basic needs-oriented government policy and appropriate budget allocations for agriculture. It's much more sexy to allocate funds for the third sector, for the digitalization, for I don't know what, of course, for military purposes, than it is for agriculture, and yet without agriculture, a functioning agriculture, we will not have sustainable development. Intensification of investment in extension services, particularly for women, and effective farm-level intervention to assist small-scale producers. I have the privilege of working with people within the OCP company, and I am enthusiastic about what is done with regard to extension services, with regard to the implementation of the 4 Rs, and that is something that is highly honorable. Accessible, economic, viable, economic agricultural inputs. It's high-yielding varieties, climate-resistant crops, fertilizer, gramine type of small credit systems. All of that is helping to support sustainable rise in productivity. And if you have higher productivity, you are likely to have higher incomes. Reduction of post-harvest losses, we know. Increases of investment in rural infrastructure, we know. The problem is, and that's something that the recent World Food System Summit has been approached, let's look at innovation in a much broader sense. Innovation is not only technical innovation, it is also social innovation, societal innovation, innovation with regard to stakeholder relations, and we can learn from other sectors where this is already produced. This last September conference, as short as it was pounding a systems approach instead of isolated interventions. Successful efforts to combat food insecurity must deal with the underlying drivers. This I was explaining. Respective endeavors must be embedded in a comprehensive poverty alleviation program that involves all relevant stakeholders in a peaceful, stable, and enabling political, social, and economic environment. That's the kind of United Nations language I was drawing your attention to. Now, it would be interesting to go home now, 6 months after the World Food System Summit, and ask in some countries, what exactly have you done as a consequence of what you have decided to do? Isolated interventions of a technical, material, and otherwise extraneous nature can provide temporary relief, but positive effects are likely to evaporate in these one-off injections if they are not integrated. Now, when we look at the recommendations of last September's Food System Summit, there is this broad view of innovation that I was pointing to. Innovation is always improvement, or mostly. Improvement is necessary in terms of how we collaborate and how we work with different stakeholders, local and governments, national governments, United Nations sector, private sector, civil society, scientific institution, and also the most vulnerable population groups. One of my experiences, I'm now nearly 35 years in poverty work. One of my experiences, very often people speak over the heads of the vulnerable people. They do not directly interact. In a way, they are seen as, we look for these people, and sometimes you ask these people or you find solutions that are not from the head of these people, but from the head of the advisors that were purchased to produce solutions. Very often and very importantly, businesses and governments must work together. I have also, in my 35 years, I was a member of the top management of Novartis, and I was a professor at the University of Basel, and in both, with both heads, so to say, I felt that there is a lot of prejudice involved. You know, I wouldn't find one single NGO that has a good word for anything that is done by industry and vice versa. And of course, with statements like this, you can please your home turf, your home stakeholders, but you will not achieve solutions. How data, as well as knowledge and technology, are used, whether current, new, scientific, and indigenous, or others. These open processes will be something that we have to learn much more about. Open processes is that you start something with a certain objective, but you are free to change course on the way. You know, if you learn in these processes permanently, and you might learn in the middle of the process that what you originally wanted to achieve is not exactly what you are going to get, whatever you do. So, you know, an open process is to be flexible as long as we go north or south or west or east, as long as we keep the major direction, we should be allowed to be flexible how we go. And very importantly here, and this is also something that I'm very pleased to diagnose at OCP, but also at UM6P, as a single institution, as a single actor, you can achieve a lot if you work hard and if God has given you the appropriate gray cells. However, only if you cooperate can you really achieve something. Only if you have different actors bringing their piece of the puzzle can you create the mosaic that you need. And that mosaic is always contextual. It's never an abstract mosaic. Now, the resources that we need for that can be mobilized. The international community last year spent more than 2,000 billion on military expenditure per year, which amounts to 5.5 billion every day. According to Ceres 2030, donors would only have to spend a combined additional 14 billion per year on average to end hunger sustainably. That is less than 3 days of current global military expenditure, and I will come back to the Ukrainian war in a moment. The current Ukrainian war is likely to drive global military expenditure much higher. From a German perspective, for many years I heard, yes, we ought to do more on environmental issues, we ought to do more with regard to overseas development assistance, but we don't have the money and we have to, you know, the black zero, don't make debt. 10 days ago, the German government decided to spend 100 billion extraordinarily on arms. So the money is there. But the political will to allocate it appropriately, obviously, is not always there. And just let's be realistic. You know, we have 100% resources. If you increase something else substantially, you will have to cut down on other things substantially as well. And this is likely to be overseas development and sustainable development resources. If we add in the resources that we are spending today by high-income countries in an increasingly futile bid to fend off uncontrolled international migration, and if we would devote them to fighting the drivers of this migration instead, even more resources would be available. And last but not least, I have seen many years in the field in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia, many institutions working parallel, duplicating efforts instead of creating synergies. So more consistency, cooperation, and coordination of all policies vis-à-vis low-income countries would create synergies and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of available financial and technical resources. This is the slide I added on Sunday before traveling here. The Consultancy Europe is estimating that 100 hours of full-scale invasion costs the Russian economy 7 billion. That does not add the Ukrainian damage, and of course, it does not calculate the human misery. And, you know, this is something all of us can say, yeah, but we are not responsible for it, but it's important to keep it in mind. It's important also for international politics that whatever you invest in peaceful efforts is much less expensive than anything that goes into a war. So what we have to do, and that brings me to the end, is, you know, we have to do much work on closing the gap between policy talk and action on the ground. The facts are known, the complexity and the interrelationships are known, the dilemmas are known, the drivers are known, the policies are known, the policy elements are known, the system approach is accepted, and the needed resources can be mobilized. Confucius once said there are 3 ways you may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is the noble, most noble. Second, by imitation, which is the easiest. And third, by experience, which is the bitterest. And dialogues like the Tables Rondes de l'Arbois, where committed and experienced people from different backgrounds come together, can contribute a lot to the ongoing debate with a fresh and innovative impulse on how do we close the gap between knowledge and political commitment. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Sénateur. Une fois de plus, absolument passionnant, parce qu'en fait, vous prenez pour une pensée différente de l'action et qui prennent en compte, en effet, la complexité des questions qui se posent à nous, s'agissant du thème d'aujourd'hui. Vraiment, vraiment intéressant. Je vais demander au professeur Naon de venez me rejoindre ici. Non, restez avec moi sur scène, Monsieur le Sénateur, parce qu'on sera heureux de vous écouter après l'intervention du professeur Naon, qui, lui, va nous parler du sol, qui est un organisme vivant. Cher Daniel, on a dit qu'on se tutoyait. Hein?
Ah oui, même en public. La question qui se pose est, aurons-nous assez de terres arables pour nourrir le monde? C'est un des aspects de l'alimentation. Je vais vous faire un peu souffrir pendant quelques minutes parce que pour répondre à cette question, il faut que vous compreniez comment se forme un sol. Et il y a quelques petites approches scientifiques simples qui vont vous permettre, j'espère, de le comprendre. Les terres émergées ne sont que la partie visible de la croûte continentale qui est constituée pour 95% de roches silicatées, c'est-à-dire sont des roches pour moitié constituées d'atomes d'oxygène, pour en gros un tiers de tout petits atomes de silicium, et pour le reste d'aluminium, de fer, de calcium, de sodium, de potassium, de magnésium, et tous les autres éléments, aussi importants soient-ils, dont on a parlé au cours de la journée d'hier, ça ne représente que 1,5% de ces roches. Les sols vont se développer grâce aux eaux de pluie à la surface de ces terres émergées sous forme d'un très mince épiderme de quelques centimètres ou dizaines de centimètres pour les sols les plus récents et jusqu'à 200 mètres pour les sols les plus vieux. Les roches sont constituées d'un assemblage de minéraux et je vous ai représenté là une vue de ces minéraux en la main sous le microscope pour vous montrer qu'il y a des feldspaths, des quartz, des biotites. On ne voit pas très bien avec ma flèche, tant pis. Et puis ces différents minéraux ont entre eux de nombreuses ces minéraux, je vais vous expliquer, puisque je vous ai dit qu'à 50% ils sont constitués d'oxygène, on les représente sous forme de balles d'oxygène, hein, c'est ce qui occupe l'essentiel du volume, et les ions à l'intérieur, plus ils sont petits et plus ils sont chargés, vont être liés à ces oxygènes. C'est le cas ici du silicium, c'est le cas ici du potassium, il faut que je revienne en arrière, du potassium qui est, lui, qui est un atome de grosse taille et qui est moins bien lié. Donc il est évident que lorsqu'il va y avoir une altération, ce sont les gros cations qui vont partir les premiers par rapport aux petits atomes. Voilà ici une image au milliardième de mètre, billionth meter scale. Je vous montre une petite fissure dans un feldspath et des molécules d'eau, un flux de molécules d'eau qui les pénètrent, et les hydrogènes de ces molécules d'eau vont être attirés par les oxygènes du minéral et vont extirper, se mettre à leur place, vont extirper les gros atomes qui vont être évacués. Ça va être un puits de dissolution, qui vont être évacués du minéral et qui vont être embarqués par le flux d'eau jusqu'aux rivières et des rivières jusqu'aux océans, et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles les océans sont salés. En revanche, les petits siliciums qui, eux, ont eu de la difficulté à être arrachés, dès qu'ils vont être évacués, vont se recombiner tout de suite avec d'autres atomes d'oxygène pour constituer de nouveaux minéraux, de tout petits minéraux, que l'on va appeler les argiles. Voilà ici l'altération d'un feldspath, vu au microscope à balayage, et bien entendu, ce sont toutes les discontinuités, toutes les fragilités des minéraux qui vont être attaqués en premier. Vous voyez dans la figure du bas, au milieu, avec des trous, c'est des macles, et c'est un plan de macles qui est plus fragile que les autres, qui a été attaqué en premier, et la roche est dissoute. Et elle est dissoute d'une telle façon, voilà, on l'a dégagée de ces argiles, et vous voyez l'altération avancée d'un feldspath avec ses puits de dissolution, et à droite, c'est pareil pour tous les autres minéraux, pour une olivine, où on va avoir l'évacuation en premier des magnésiums et du fer, et en dernier des ions de silicium. Voilà ici un minéral, un pyroxène, qui a été altéré et qui a été altéré en argile. L'argile est ce que vous voyez à côté, qui a une structure en nid d'abeille, et c'est cette argile qui va constituer le sol qui se développe au-dessus des roches. Voilà une vue en la mince pour vous montrer en gris ce que sont les pyroxènes. altérés en argile chatoyante. Et bien entendu, je vous ai mis cette photo uniquement pour le plaisir de vos yeux. Voilà la constitution d'une argile. Donc les argiles, c'est ce qu'on appelle des silicates enfeuillés, des phyllosilicates, et qui sont chargés électriquement sur leur feuillet, et ce qui permet à des tas de molécules simples, minérales, comme le magnésium, Mg, ou le calcium, de s'y arrimer, ou des molécules organiques plus complexes, de s'arrimer aux surfaces des argiles, de telle façon que les argiles vont constituer un véritable réservoir de nutriments pour les relâcher au fur et à mesure de la demande vers les racines des plantes ou vers les bactéries. À gauche, vous avez donc comment se constitue un sol, c'est-à-dire vous avez un granit qui s'est altéré progressivement en un sol rouge, argileux, teinté ici par des oxydes de fer. Plus un sol est épais, plus il est âgé. Vous avez en petit tas, en haut, une coulée récente de basalte à La Réunion, et vous voyez, il n'y a pas de sol développé dessus. En petit b, une coulée basaltique un peu plus vieille, où il y a eu une première altération en argile, et aussitôt un développement de la végétation. Puis en C, c'est une coulée encore plus vieille, avec un développement du sol et de la végétation plus conséquente. Et enfin, en bas, une coulée qui a 1 million d'années et sur laquelle l'altération a eu le temps de jouer et a développé des sols importants de plusieurs mètres et s'est installée une forêt luxuriante. Le sol, c'est l'aboutissement de tout cela. C'est à la fois l'altération de la roche dure, parentale en argile, c'est l'installation d'une végétation qui va réagir avec l'atmosphère et la pluie et qui va entraîner par photosynthèse le développement donc, de cette végétation, mais c'est aussi l'installation dans l'argile d'une très grande biodiversité, essentiellement bactérienne, c'est-à-dire ce qu'on appelle une biodiversité de l'ombre, qu'on ne voit pas, sur laquelle on marche et qu'on ignore totalement. Et je peux vous dire que les grands organismes sur la biodiversité parlent beaucoup d'animaux, beaucoup de végétaux, mais ignorent totalement la biodiversité de l'ombre, qui pourtant correspond à une masse vivante plus importante que toute la masse vivante qui est à la surface de la planète. Je récapitule très clairement, avec ce schéma simplifié, une roche dure, rouge, silicatée, fracturée, dans laquelle l'eau de pluie va s'infiltrer, va commencer à altérer les minéraux, former de l'argile, s'installe aussitôt une végétation. Plus l'altération avance, plus la végétation se développe. Cette végétation, au cours des ans et des saisons, va livrer de la matière organique au sol, qui va être fragmentée, divisée par des petites ouvrières qui sont simplement les bactéries, de façon à développer un humus et rendre disponibles des molécules organiques qui vont être absorbées par les racines des plantes. Si bien qu'on a ce qu'on appelle un horizon humifère qu'on appelle A, un horizon argileux qu'on appelle B, et un horizon de transition, d'altération avec la roche parentale qu'on appelle roche-mère. Cela pour vous montrer que la formation du sol requiert beaucoup de temps. Il faut 1000 ans pour faire 5 mm de sol par altération. Le temps requis pour avoir un sol arable de quelques dizaines de centimètres, c'est entre 20 et 30 000 ans. Et les sols les plus vieux, de plusieurs mètres, voire plusieurs dizaines de mètres, se situent dans la zone tropicale. À l'évidence, les sols ne sont pas une ressource renouvelable à l'échelle humaine. Le sol est un réservoir de carbone considérable. Il a à peu près 3 fois plus de carbone que l'atmosphère et, en gros, 4 fois plus que toute la matière vivante à la surface du globe. Je reviens en arrière pour vous montrer quelque chose d'important. Les mauvaises pratiques agricoles ont contribué depuis 1850, la fin du XIXe siècle, à fournir à l'atmosphère à peu près 40% des gaz à effet de serre. Et je regrette beaucoup qu'en reconstituant ma diapositive, les techniciens m'aient enlevé ce que j'avais marqué. Ça allait jusqu'à 290 milliards de tonnes de carbone qui avaient été livrées pendant cette période. Selon les publications, ça variait entre 190 et 290 milliards de tonnes de carbone libérées, ce qui correspond à peu près à ce qu'a libéré le milieu industriel avec l'utilisation des combustibles fossiles de l'ordre de 300 milliards de tonnes de carbone. Le sol est un environnement vivant. Il n'y a pas de sol qui produit s'il n'y a pas de biodiversité dans le sol. La biomasse vivante en poids dans les 30 cm supérieurs du sol équivalent à peu près 8 tonnes par hectare, c'est-à-dire en équivalent, ce serait en poids vif de 500 moutons par hectare. Et cette vie n'est possible qu'à 2 conditions. C'est grâce aux minéraux argileux et à la matière organique qu'il y a dans le sol. Ce qui veut dire que le sol est un énorme réservoir de nutriments et de biodiversité et qui contient jusqu'à 98% de la diversité génétique de l'écosystème terrestre. C'est le sol qui contrôle en grande partie le cycle du carbone, le cycle de l'azote et bien sûr celui de beaucoup d'autres nutriments et qui va jouer de conserve avec les plantes et les végétaux pour constituer un système très actif. Pour ceux qui n'ont jamais vu de sol, c'est possible, hein. J'ai décidé de vous montrer 1 ou 2 exemples de sol. Voilà un sol brun des zones tempérées. Vous voyez, c'est des zones peu épais. L'argile est brune parce qu'elle est teintée de matière organique arrimée à la surface des particules d'argile. Là, vous avez un horizon à gauche, un horizon épais de matière organique, d'humus, ce qui en fait un sol très fertile. Et à droite, ce qui est rouge, ce sont les sols tropicaux, c'est-à-dire des sols épais sur plusieurs dizaines de mètres. Et vous pouvez remarquer, à part le système racinaire, qu'il y a peu d'horizons organiques pour une raison simple, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de saison et que les bactéries travaillent toute l'année. Et elles travaillent et elles minéralisent la matière organique, c'est-à-dire qu'elles transforment le carbone en gaz carbonique qui s'échappe. Elles transforment l'azote en protoxyde d'azote qui s'échappe, qui sont des gaz à effet de serre. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle les grandes forêts tropicales sont à la fois des puits et des sources de gaz à effet de serre. Revenons aux argiles. En gros, il y a 2 grands types d'argiles, ce qu'on appelle les kaolinites et les smectites. je vous ai montré comment était constitué un feuillet d'argile. Ces feuillets vont s'empiler comme des jeux de cartes les uns sur les autres, plus ou moins bien ajustés, parce qu'il y a des tas d'impuretés, et ils vont se superposer en ce qu'on appelle des cristallites. Par exemple, une cristallite de kaolinite va avoir un empilement d'à peu près 100 feuillets d'argile. Une smectite va avoir à peu près un empilement de 10 feuillets d'argile. Et bien sûr, en s'organisant entre eux, ils vont créer des porosités dans lesquelles l'eau va circuler, l'eau de pluie. Et vous voyez qu'en ce qui concerne les smectites, vous reconnaissez, enfin à peu près, la structure en nid d'abeille que je vous montrais tout à l'heure. L'eau va pénétrer dans les vides que vous avez vus, mais va pénétrer aussi entre les feuillets qui sont tenus par des atomes en verre ici, qui peuvent être des atomes de potassium, de sodium, de magnésium. Et ces particules d'eau, qui sont en rouge avec les deux petits atomes d'hydrogène en bleu, vont entourer ces atomes et vont faire gonfler les feuillets d'argile, parfois au double de leur épaisseur. Et lorsqu'il y aura une période aride, cette eau va être retirée. Et c'est ce mouvement de gonflement et de retrait, sans arrêt, répété à travers les saisons, sans arrêt répété à travers le temps, qui va permettre aux particules d'argile de s'organiser en une structure. Et c'est cette structure, la voilà, cette structure, avec des sous-structures, qui va aider le sol à être stable à travers le temps et à résister à l'érosion. Voilà une photo d'un vertisol avec une structure prismatique, et dessous, vous voyez que cette structure prismatique est formée elle-même de plusieurs polyèdres, mais si vous détruisez cette structure par la charrue, par le soc de la charrue, vous allez immédiatement avoir une érosion possible bien supérieure à l'érosion naturelle. Dans les sols, voilà ici un oxysoil. Merci les techniciens d'avoir caché l'écriture qu'il y a écrit au-dessus. Et donc, c'est une poudre à café, c'est une structure en poudre à café qui n'est pas visible à l'œil nu, on ne voit pas, il faut regarder au microscope. Vous avez un petit trait gris qui correspond à peu près à 100 microns, et vous voyez que c'est des petites structures glomérulaires qu'on appelle des structures de poudre à café, et qui permet à l'eau d'être essuyée facilement. Et c'est pour ça qu'après des grands orages tropicaux, cette air se ressuie très rapidement. Merci beaucoup. Pas de clé, pas d'argile sans altération des roches, pas de sol sans argile et pas de vie et de biodiversité sans argile. Là, je ne remercie pas du tout la technique d'avoir modifié ces diapositives. Je suis vraiment désolé, mais en gros, toutes les terres émergées constituent 15 milliards d'hectares, mais toutes ne portent pas des sols. Il y a simplement 11,5 milliards d'hectares qui portent des sols. Et tous ces sols ne sont pas arables. Il n'y a que 2,5 milliards d'hectares de sols qui soient arables et que je vous montre ici, parmi ces 22% de sols arables, 3 ont une bonne fertilité, 6 une fertilité moyenne et 13 une fertilité faible. Tous les autres sols ne peuvent pas être cultivables parce qu'ils sont sur des pentes trop fortes, dans des climats trop chauds ou trop froids, où le sol est trop fin pour être cultivé, ou trop pauvre, ou trop humide et marécageux. Il y a ces sols vont être dégradés, il y a plusieurs agents de dégradation des sols. On ne peut pas tous les voir, mais on va en voir trois principaux. Ces trois principaux sont, merci encore à la technique, sont l'urbanisation, sont la déforestation et sont les mauvaises pratiques agricoles. L'urbanisation, au début du siècle dernier, c'était 14% de la population qui vivait dans des villes. Aujourd'hui, c'est 55%, et dans moins de 3 décennies, ce sera 65%, avec une augmentation de 5% en Afrique, dans les villes d'Afrique, par an. Chaque année, c'est l'équivalent de la surface du 5 Danemark, une surface équivalente à 5 fois celle du Danemark, qui est urbanisée. Heureusement, pas toujours sur des sols arables. On estime à peu près qu'un tiers des sols qui sont urbanisés étaient des sols arables, donc qui n'existent plus. Et ce phénomène ne s'arrêtera pas, puisque le mètre carré de béton vaut 10 000 fois plus cher que le mètre carré de sol arable. Et vous connaissez notre système. On ne regardera pas le sol arable, mais ce qui rentabilise le plus. Déforestation, c'est à peu près 14 milliards d'hectares par an. C'est un peu moins de 1% des forêts mondiales, mais c'est l'équivalent d'une forêt française qui est déforestée chaque année. Les mauvaises pratiques agricoles, c'est les labours, bien entendu, une irrigation excessive, une perte de nutriments, des cultures inappropriées, ça existe, on le voit dans les campagnes où les gens irriguent en plein été des cultures. C'est un excès de pâturage, c'est une pauvre, voire une non-connaissance des techniques de labour, c'est une inégale distribution des terres agricoles et c'est l'usage de boue urbaine et des tas d'autres choses qui font que les sols se dégradent. Là, ça devient un petit peu agaçant. Je m'adresse à la technique. Je vous ai demandé de ne pas modifier mes diapositives. Vous avez voulu les modifier. Voilà ce que ça donne. Je ne vous félicite pas. Lorsqu'on diminue la biodiversité du sol, celle qu'on ne voit pas, il faut savoir que des mauvaises pratiques agricoles comme pratiquement les monocultures simplement, vous avez une diminution de 40% de la biodiversité. L'usage de pesticides entraîne une diminution de 80% de la biodiversité. Et le fait que cette biodiversité diminue va entraîner, bien sûr, une perte de la production agricole. Par exemple, pour le maïs, elle est depuis la fin des années 90 de 4%. Ça ne vous paraît pas grand-chose. C'est la production agricole du Mexique qui est à l'origine du maïs. D'où vient le maïs? C'est une diminution de 6% de la production de blé. Ça ne vous paraît pas énorme, c'est quand même la production, l'équivalent de la production française. De tout cela, de la déforestation et des mauvaises pratiques agricoles, naît ce qu'on appelle l'érosion. Et l'érosion est fatale au sol parce qu'elle va emmener une déficience dans la fertilité et un déclin d'1 tiers de la production alimentaire. Voilà quelques images. Vous voyez que ce paysage est un paysage qui n'est pas tellement un paysage montagneux, et dès que vous avez des labours, vous avez une altération très forte. Dès que, voilà ici des études que nous avons menées au Brésil, et ces ravines que vous voyez là, qui ont été faites dans des sols argileux, ont été faites en 2 décennies, alors qu'il a fallu plusieurs millions d'années pour faire des sols aussi épais. Voilà ici des sols peu épais qui servent au pâturage, et là aussi par un excès de pâturage, c'est-à-dire un excès d'ovins ou de bovins sur des terres, peut entraîner une érosion fatale au sol. Et il y a des sols qui peuvent disparaître. On connaît des coins en Afrique ou au Brésil où la roche est mise à nu, c'est-à-dire ce qui a requis plusieurs millions d'années avec l'érosion. Cette érosion va dans les rivières, bien sûr, c'est de la boue, hein. Tout le monde voit ça au mois d'avril sur les routes et les campagnes, et va remplir les lits des rivières. Alors les rivières coulent toujours, mais la profondeur du lit, au lieu d'être de 2 mètres, n'est que de 20 cm. Et il suffit d'avoir des orages particulièrement violents pour avoir des inondations. Je résume pour vous montrer vraiment le malheur de l'érosion. Vous avez au fond ce qu'on appelle un front d'altération, un weathering front, qui est le front de formation du sol en profondeur et qui n'avance que de 5 mm par 1000 ans. Et au-dessus, vous avez un front d'érosion qui progresse de 50 cm à 5 mètres tous les 1000 ans, c'est-à-dire qui va 100 à 1000 fois plus vite que la formation du sol. Si on continue à avoir les mêmes pratiques agricoles et à traiter le sol de la même façon, le calcul est simple. Les sols des pays tempérés font moins d'1 mètre sur les pentes, sur les reliefs, un peu plus dans les plaines alluviales. Donc vous pouvez imaginer à quelle allure nous allons détruire ces sols. C'est vraiment désespérant, hein, vraiment désespérant. Pour 20% des sols, c'est entre... on a une érosion pour 20% des sols qui est supérieure à 20 tonnes par hectare et par an. Ça peut atteindre 200 tonnes par hectare et par an dans certaines zones en Afrique. Pour l'essentiel des sols, pour 50% des sols, l'érosion varie entre 7,5 tonnes par hectare et par an et 20 tonnes par hectare et par an. Et enfin, pour 1/3 des sols, l'érosion est inférieure à 7,5 tonnes par hectare et par an. Ce qui veut dire que si vous comparez avec une érosion naturelle qui est inférieure à 0,5 tonnes par hectare et par an, vous mesurez que l'homme est le principal agent d'érosion. Pour une érosion modérée, qui est courante dans les pays tempérés, c'est-à-dire inférieure à 3 tonnes par hectare et par an, ce sont des kilos par hectare et par an de carbone organique, d'azote organique qui sont perdus parce que la partie supérieure des sols est la plus riche. Ce sont des kilos d'ions échangeables, de potassium, de sodium, de calcium, de magnésium, d'oligo-éléments qui sont perdus. Ce sont aussi entre 10 et 25% des fertilisants que l'on y a ajoutés qui partent avec l'érosion. Ce sont jusqu'à 35 ou 40% des pesticides. Et ceux-là ne sont pas perdus pour tout le monde, puisqu'on les retrouve dans les rivières, et ce sont à ce moment-là les végétaux marins ou la faune marine qui va en profiter ou hélas pas en profiter, mais c'est pour ça que les algues vont proliférer dans nos rivières ou sur nos rivages. Et là, je n'ai pas compté en poids de vie ce qui est arraché au sol. Et en poids de vie, il faut que vous sachiez que dans une cuillère à café de sol, vous avez à peu près 1 milliard de bactéries. C'est un tiers des sols arables, en moyenne globale, qui sont dégradés à l'heure actuelle. Et on sait qu'il ne reste que 600 millions d'hectares de terres arables qui restent à utiliser et pour nourrir une population dont les besoins en nourriture doivent augmenter de 50% d'ici 2050. 2050, c'est là, hein, dans presque même pas 3 décennies, et cela dans un monde qui devient de plus en plus chaud, avec un déséquilibre climatique entre les 2 hémisphères. Il faut que vous sachiez que quand on a des modèles du GIEC qui vous expliquent que le réchauffement climatique va être en moyenne, dans un des scénarios, de 2 degrés ou 2,5 degrés, c'est une moyenne. Ça veut dire que les terres vont réchauffer beaucoup plus vite que les masses océaniques. Cela est dû à la qualité de la molécule d'eau, à la chaleur latente par rapport à la molécule de solide, et en plus à la masse océanique, bien sûr. Et donc, comme les terres vont réchauffer beaucoup plus vite, elles vont être de 7, 8 ou 9 degrés plus élevées. Et le véritable enjeu du réchauffement climatique, c'est l'agriculture et l'eau. Et cette courbe récente entre l'hémisphère sud, la courbe bleue, et l'hémisphère nord, la courbe de température rouge, montre que les 2 hémisphères, les températures n'évoluent pas de la même façon et que l'hémisphère nord va réchauffer beaucoup plus vite. Même dans les modélisations qui sont faites pour la fin du siècle, c'est l'hémisphère nord parce que c'est là que sont concentrés le maximum des terres, mais aussi le maximum des industries polluantes. On arrive à un système complexe dont le cœur de ce système complexe est constitué par le sol lui-même. Et si on fait un bilan au bout d'un siècle de ce que notre agriculture intensive donne, eh bien, cette agriculture intensive, c'est vraiment très, très, très agréable. Cette agriculture ne nourrit pas bien une personne sur 10, rend obèse une personne sur 10. Les petits fermiers n'arrivent plus à subvenir à leurs besoins et beaucoup d'entre eux se suicident. Il faut savoir que l'agriculture utilise 4 fois plus d'énergie que l'industrie, qu'elle utilise 86% de l'eau douce en moyenne. Il y a des pays qui consacrent 98% de leur eau douce à l'agriculture. Que cette agriculture détruit l'environnement d'une manière générale, crée des dommages à l'environnement et à la santé des fermiers, et qu'elle appauvrit considérablement les sols et la biodiversité. C'est toute l'agriculture et tout le système agriculture qu'il faut repenser. Bien sûr, l'essentiel est de conserver les sols en bonne santé et ça reste l'objectif global si l'on veut avoir une production agricole importante. C'est ce qu'on appelait la soil security au sein du système complexe. Il faut essayer de comprendre que les sols sont tous différents les uns des autres et même sur une pente, vous n'avez pas les mêmes sols entre l'amont et l'aval. Et donc, on ne peut pas utiliser et travailler les sols avec les mêmes techniques universelles et on ne peut pas appliquer les techniques qui ont été développées dans les pays tempérés aux pays tropicaux. De même, tous ces sols étant de compositions différentes ne peuvent pas porter les mêmes cultures. Il faut changer drastiquement de méthode de culture et de méthode d'irrigation. Il n'y a pas que les sols, bien sûr, il y a d'autres facteurs d'ordre politique, d'ordre économique, d'ordre technique qui vont jouer sur Nourrir le Monde. Il n'y a pas que le sol, bien sûr, mais parmi ces quelques éléments, on en a évoqué là au cours de ces 2 jours, il faut qu'il y ait des droits et un accès aux terres arables. 84% des fermes aujourd'hui dans le monde ont moins de 2 hectares. Il faut aussi qu'il y ait un accès régulé à l'eau, à l'énergie. Il faut que les femmes soient considérées comme étant des propriétaires. Il n'y a que 15% de femmes qui sont propriétaires. En revanche, il y a 85% de femmes qui sont des ouvrières agricoles. Il faut que les petits fermiers et les utilisateurs des sols puissent être au fait des nouvelles techniques et des innovations pour l'agriculture, ce qui n'est pas le cas. Il faut donner enfin un vrai prix à la production de la nourriture. Et là, je voudrais parler en termes de PIB. Le PIB est une notion qui a été inventée par Simon Kuznets il y a à peu près 90 ans, à la suite de la crise de 1929. Et toute l'économie a été basée, c'est une mesure de la performance sociale, a été basée sur l'augmentation du PIB. Mais cette augmentation du PIB, quand vous la corrélez d'une manière, elle est corrélée d'une manière parfaite avec l'utilisation des combustibles fossiles. Je crois qu'il faut désormais donner un prix à l'eau, donner un prix à la qualité de l'air, un prix aux forêts, un prix au sol, et il faut rentrer dans le calcul du PIB ces valeurs des richesses naturelles. Voilà, j'espère que, oui, l'enjeu principal, c'est l'Afrique avec plus de 60% des réserves de terres arables, bien que toutes ces terres ont des déficients en nutriments et qu'elles ne peuvent pas être considérées, par exemple, dans le Green Deal européen, on demande qu'il y ait moins 20% de fertilisants. Si vous faites ça en Afrique, tout le monde meurt de faim. L'Afrique, c'est une augmentation de 30% des fertilisants si vous voulez nourrir les populations. Voilà, j'espère que j'ai combattu un peu l'illettrisme sur le sol avec cet exposé. En tous les cas, que chacun d'entre vous puisse l'expliquer autour de vous et même à vos animaux domestiques, vous aurez fait un grand pas en avant pour le sol lui-même. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je veux bien me rejoindre parce que je trouve cette matinée tout à fait, les précédentes étaient aussi, mais tout à fait passionnante parce que cette fois, on met les mains dans le moteur. C'est-à-dire que quand on parlait de la nécessité de la pluridisciplinarité pour comprendre la complexité des systèmes, la présentation que tu viens de faire, Daniel, de ce qu'est le sol est extrêmement intéressante. Et parce que là, on est dans une lecture où le seul, lui, il pratique la pluridisciplinarité. Et il la pratique naturellement. Et d'ailleurs, Monsieur Christian, tout à l'heure, vous évoquiez, ça m'a paru extrêmement intéressant, la nécessité de l'action, celle de l'imitation et celle de l'expérience. Après l'intervention à l'instant du professeur Naon, on se rend compte à quel point l'imitation est une chose nécessaire. Mais je voudrais commencer par quelque chose qui m'a sidéré, c'est le choc de la temporalité. 2000 ans pour faire 5 mm de sol. Si on confronte ces 2000 ans nécessaires à faire 5 mm de sol à ce que nous appelons le progrès, et le progrès de nos technologies qui font de façon permanente la promotion de l'immédiateté, on est dans un rapport impossible. On ne peut pas, d'un côté, améliorer l'accélération de tous les process et ne pas prendre en compte le fait qu'il faut 2000 ans pour faire 5 mm de sol. Comment, tenez, j'aimerais avoir votre avis là-dessus. Comment on fait avec cette réalité qui s'impose à nous? Là, on n'est plus dans les concepts, on est dans le concret.
I want to give two answers. Keynes once said, in the long run, we are all dead. So there is an obvious necessity to look after short-term interests. And the art is not to look on short-term interests only. Most of the people I know, the elder people, have grandchildren and children, and they say our children once should be better off than we were, and yet with their production and consumption pattern, they prevent exactly this.
Nobody can hear you. I don't
Okay.
know if it's working or not.
I don't know. Is it better now? Okay. I will not start again. I just said we cannot complain about short-termism. There is a justification for things to happen in the short term. In the long run, we are all dead. This is a quote from John Maynard Keynes. But the grandparents and the parents who say we want our children to have a better life than we had, through their consumption and production patterns, may prevent just that. That's one thing. The second thing, one of the slides Professor Nahon was showing said, spoke about what is an honest price. Most of the prices do not represent the ecological truth. They kind of use ecology as an externality that does not go quantified into the economic system, which gives the wrong direction, the wrong incentives. People work according to incentives. So, a lot of the things, it is incomprehensible to most of the people that 5 millimeters take 2,000 years. This is beyond the imagination of what people, normal people, can have. And the same with regard to the pesticides. The destruction of biological diversity as a result of pesticide use is a wanted effect in the short term. Only if you look at it in the long term will you see that all of a sudden, if you don't have bees anymore, you have a big problem. So what we all have to do, from the teachers in the school to the university professors, from the parents and grandparents to the children, talk about this. Talk that the lure of the short-term benefit has risks that might be very painful. And secondly, what can be quantified in euros and dollars is not necessarily the value of something. And, you know, this is an educational task we all have to take. And in the end, you know, we are nearly 9 billion, 8 billion, more than 8 billion people. The individual small steps of 8 billion people have much more impact than the waiting for the Deus ex machina.
Évidemment que on est là vraiment pour de bon dans la complexité. Mais ce qui m'a frappé, Daniel, dans ce que tu disais tout à l'heure, c'est qu'au fond, entre la fin du 19e et jusqu'à aujourd'hui, l'accélération et la dégradation est telle que tu poses très clairement la question de la disparition du sol. La disparition du sol, ce sera inéluctablement la disparition de l'espèce humaine. Est-ce que ça, à côté, on y viendra ensuite de l'enjeu de modifier probablement la définition du PIB et ses applications, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas une impérative nécessité politique? Je ne parle pas de politique politicienne, c'est comment on partage l'espace de la cité. La Terre, c'est notre cité commune. Tant qu'il n'y aura pas une vision politique qui prenne en compte ces réalités que chacun d'entre vous, et depuis hier, met en perspective, je dirais qu'on va direct dans le mur. Tu vois, on est déjà dans le mur.
Thank you. Oui, c'est impressionnant, mais c'est la science qui montre ça. Hein. C'est pas, comment dire, c'est pas une vue de l'esprit, c'est une réalité. Et la réalité, celle qu'on a devant les yeux. On a un héritage important. Il faut savoir que les sols des pays tropicaux ont commencé à se former il y a 55 millions d'années. Et que nous avons eu des glaciations importantes dans l'hémisphère nord qui a raboté ces sols et qui, lorsqu'on avait des sols gelés, ça a été une débâcle. Donc tout a repris avec le réchauffement et on a formé des sols et il y a des publications très sérieuses et qui s'avèrent être tout à fait pointues et réalistes, et je pense à Rudiman et à toute son équipe, qui ont montré que c'est avec le développement de l'agriculture que le réchauffement a commencé. Alors, il est très difficile parce que tout ça avance à bas bruit. Par exemple, là, on voit que les deux hémisphères, la chaleur des deux hémisphères diverge à partir des années, on va dire, 2000. Mais on voit que par rapport au cycle solaire, ça s'est déjà dégagé aux années 70. Puis le réchauffement n'a pas pu être vraiment mesuré avant. Donc, tout avance à différentes échelles, à bas bruit, comme une maladie pour quelqu'un, hein, où on ne sent pas la maladie, on réagit tous différemment à différentes maladies, et celles-ci vont se déclarer d'un coup, mais elles sont là depuis plusieurs années, et on ne les voyait pas. Et la gestion de la terre, c'est un peu ça. La gestion des sols, c'est un peu ça. Et aujourd'hui, on est face à un problème. Alors, j'entends des gens qui critiquent les scientifiques. Oui, mais je leur dis, attendez, vous êtes au courant de tout ça grâce aux scientifiques. Et donc, les solutions qui peuvent être abordées sont de 3 ordres. Elles sont, bien entendu, d'ordre écologique, hein, ça va de soi. Mais elles ne sont pas que cela, elles sont aussi d'ordre solidaire et elles sont aussi d'ordre scientifique. Donc il faut que l'agriculture soit repensée entièrement.
Il y a un formidable enjeu pédagogique. C'est-à-dire, et peut-être qu'on est ici d'ailleurs dans un lieu où cet enjeu doit être impérativement, mais je sais qu'il l'est, mis encore plus en perspective. C'est-à-dire que non seulement les enfants doivent être informés dès leur plus jeune âge, mais les responsables politiques, mais les décideurs économiques. Parce que notre système économique, monsieur Lessinger, il est à court terme. Le productivisme, c'est la rentabilité dans les meilleurs délais. On n'est pas du tout, là encore, décidément, dans la même temporalité. Or, comment se fait-il que les responsables de l'économie planétaire ne se rendent pas compte qu'eux-mêmes sont en train de mettre en péril ce système économique tel qu'il est conçu? Ça ne pourra pas durer. Alors, combien de temps on va continuer à dire que ça ne peut pas durer? Oui, monsieur Lessinger, et puis Daniel, bien sûr.
Yes, and we know that. We know that, and still, what we, at least those who are teaching and those who are informing others, ought to learn is to make things easier understandable. Let me give you 2 examples. We hear a lot of this chaos theory where this famous butterfly in Asia with his wings creates a tornado in the United States. So, most people are not aware that if the 1.4 billion Chinese decide to take 1 beer more a day, that this absorbs the whole corn harvest of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. 1 beer a day. Vice versa, a lot of the small changes that we can afford to do in Europe can cumulatively have a huge impact. So it's the pattern that we also live. It's the no difference between the talking and the walking. If we say, consumption light, or if we say not our use of energy just because it's too expensive, ought to be changed. Now, one of the positive externalities of this terrible war is that energy, gas, oil, coal becomes very important and very much more expensive, and that this could help to create an ecological transformation that we all need. And the last point, let's also look at the dilemmas or at the inconsistencies. The same climate change that destroys the living base in Eastern and Western Africa, through its de-icing of Alaska and Siberia, creates new fertile land somewhere else. So, the interests, the interest to avoid something is not always the same. And there we come back, that's the place of universities, that's the place of the United Nations. Where can we bring people together and say, come on, it has to do with the knowledge, it has to do with values, with fairness, and it's possible. And let's also to learn to praise the small steps of progress, because we cannot continue to moan and to criticize and to be sad. That does not motivate people. Let's look for the positive case studies and make them part of the message. We can do it, we know how to do it, and we will do it.
Oui, Daniel, oui, sur cette question
pour
importante.
rebondir sur ce que, pour montrer la stupidité des fois des raisonnements politiques ou économiques, là on vient de dire exactement, il y a des gens qui disent, bon, le réchauffement climatique va être terrible pour certains pays, mais il va libérer des terres agricoles dans d'autres pays. Mais il faut savoir que quand le pergélisol fond, une étude récente de l'année dernière a montré qu'il y a dans les pergélisols un nombre de bactéries pathogènes résistantes à tous les antibiotiques connus.
Il y a eu une anecdote, qui n'est pas une anecdote, mais qui a malheureusement pris la place d'une anecdote dans les journaux, c'est-à-dire 4 lignes. Un éleveur de Rennes est sorti un matin de chez lui, plus de 1000 têtes de troupeaux mortes. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Libération de bactéries du pergélisol. Ça a fait 3 lignes dans les journaux. Mais au fond, la Covid, ça en fait beaucoup plus. Mais nous voilà confrontés à de nouveaux périls qui sont liés aussi aux enjeux du sol.
Oui, mais aux enjeux de l'eau, aux enjeux du sol.
Voilà, ouais.
Par exemple, c'est vrai que moi j'aime bien dire le Covid. Hein. Je suis un macho pour les virus.
Oui,
voilà
bien.
plutôt.
Vas-y.
Et donc, je trouve que c'est vrai que le Covid nous a tous ébranlés. J'ai même vu des amis, je les ai à peine reconnus tellement ils ont vieilli. Hein. Je ne les avais pas vus depuis 2 ans. Et enfin, là, je plaisante. Mais je voulais dire que c'est excessivement important de réaliser qu'on est tous embarqués dans un système complexe. Le monde est un système complexe et qu'il suffit des fois d'une toute petite bestiole pour tout chambouler. Alors, on est tous vraiment émus par le nombre de morts qu'il y a. Je crois que c'est à peu près 6 000 morts par jour dans le monde par le Covid en moyenne sur les 3 ans qui arrivent. Mais c'est 25 000 enfants, donc pas enfants, 25 000 personnes qui meurent chaque jour pour boire des eaux qui sont des eaux qui ne sont pas des bonnes eaux, des eaux polluées. 25 000, dont une grande part d'enfants. Donc il faut à chaque fois ramener. Et le problème de l'homme politique ou de la femme politique, et il y en a ici dans cette salle, on en a discuté, c'est d'essayer de projeter au plus loin. Hein. Malheureusement, on regarde au plus près, c'est ce que tu dis, c'est une question de vitesse, une question de raisonnement à long terme. Donc, l'homme ou la femme politique doit être à part entière un acteur de l'alimentation du monde, un acteur de l'agriculture. Ça doivent être des gens très cultivés. Voilà.
Alors, tu dis la chose qui précède la question que j'avais envie de te poser, c'est la question de l'accès à la connaissance. Quand tu disais tout à l'heure que même les agriculteurs aujourd'hui, qui malheureusement sont une espèce en voie de disparition, n'ont pas accès suffisamment à la connaissance des nouvelles technologies, des innovations, des modes d'emploi du sol sur lequel quotidiennement ils travaillent. Cet enjeu de l'accès à la connaissance, il est premier. Il faut que la place de la science aujourd'hui dans nos sociétés soit infiniment plus importante, à tout niveau, de l'agriculteur jusqu'aux responsables politiques.
C'est le rôle des tables rondes. C'est le rôle des tables rondes. Les tables rondes ont été formées pour que les gens viennent, pour que le public vienne, pour qu'il écoute des scientifiques de haut niveau et que ces scientifiques puissent débattre avec le public, avec les gens, avec les hommes politiques. Je vais citer, on a fait un jour une table ronde c'était sur les milieux urbains et les villes. Et on a eu le maire de Curitiba, qui est un maire, qui est un architecte, qui est une figure mondiale. Le maire de New York allait à Curitiba pour voir comment ce maire avait réussi à faire sa ville. Donc on était très heureux. On a averti tous les hommes politiques, tous les maires des villes où on faisait, à Aix-Marseille. Il n'y a pas eu un maire d'un village même qui est venu écouter ce monsieur. Voilà. Et donc, il avait un charisme, il était extraordinaire. Il nous a expliqué comment il a transformé sa ville. Donc, je crois que les hommes politiques et les femmes politiques sont perdus dans un quotidien qui est terrible. C'est la gestion. Regardez ici, les tables rondes, on les a fait à l'université d'Aix-Marseille. Il n'y a pas un responsable de notre université qui a pris le temps de venir. Parce qu'ils sont perdus dans un quotidien et ils n'arrivent plus à discerner ce qui est important. Il y a tellement de choses qui ne sont pas importantes. Il y a tellement de réunions qui ne servent à rien. Il y a tellement de discours qui disent des lieux communs. il faut arrêter, il faut se tourner vers la consistance, vers la réalité. Voilà, hein, c'est un message direct au monde scientifique. On est sur YouTube en direct. J'ose espérer que des hommes et des femmes scientifiques nous écoutent. Moi, je suis optimiste parce que tous les scientifiques sont optimistes. Et on se dit, il va y avoir une prise de conscience. Mais là, on arrive au bord du gouffre.
Ah oui.
Il faut quand même... alors moi, j'avais une discussion avec M. Mamère, il me disait, on n'a que 10 ans devant nous. J'ai dit, Mamère, ça fait 20 ans que tu dis ça, que tu as 10 ans devant toi. On devrait être au fond du puits. Non, parce qu'il y a une résilience. Par exemple, les forêts vierges d'Afrique ou les forêts vierges d'Amazonie ne sont pas des forêts vierges. Elles ont été envahies par des hommes il y a 2000, 3000, 4000, 5000 ans qui ont fait une agriculture et qui l'ont quittée. Et il y a une résilience de la forêt qu'on prend pour... Ça, c'est des travaux qui sont sortis au CEREJ par des jeunes du CEREJ, là, maintenant, qui font des travaux magnifiques. Par exemple, qui c'est qui parlait? C'est toi qui parlais de la forêt, des feux de forêt et des black carbone. Le black carbone est une suie qui est libérée. Et bon, c'est compliqué hein, quand on parle des particules et des aérosols, parce que beaucoup créent un refroidissement. Mais ces black carbone, à l'inverse, créent un réchauffement parce qu'elles absorbent les rayons lumineux visibles du soleil. Et elles sont en train de modifier même le cycle de l'eau de la mousson chinoise. Et c'est des équipes qui font ça. On a un jeune patron qui s'appelle Édouard Barre au CEREJ qui a étudié la vallée de Chamonix, où il y a un réchauffement un peu plus fort que dans le reste de la France. Oui. Et tous les Verts criaient en disant « Ouais, c'est les camions qui passent, qui vont entre la France et l'Italie, il faut arrêter ces camions. »
Rien à voir.
Ok, voilà. Donc imaginez économiquement le poids. Imaginez que quelqu'un arrive et que pour une élection, ils disent « Oui, il faut arrêter les camions. » Alors eux sont arrivés avec leurs beaux instruments, leurs belles cervelles, et ont étudié le carbone émis dans cette vallée, ces gaz à effet de serre, et ont montré que l'essentiel, il y a une part des transports, mais que l'essentiel venait des feux de cheminée des habitants. Donc, on est dans un monde, on marche sur la tête. Et quand il y a eu un article dans Le Monde, les réactions ont dit oui, mais ces gens sont vendus à la grande industrie. Enfin, c'est n'importe quoi.
Oui, mais
voilà.
ça renvoie. C'est pour ça que j'ai insisté dessus tout à l'heure. J'ai trouvé ça très plaisant, le titre qu'a choisi Klaus Singer, parce que c'est une pensée différente de l'action. Oui, il y a les concepts. Oui, il y a la réflexion. En attendant, ce sont les poules qui pondent les œufs. Donc, une pensée différente de l'action aujourd'hui, une approche pluridisciplinaire et une beaucoup plus grande ouverture à la connaissance scientifique pour l'ensemble de la cité. Il me semble que je ne vois pas d'autre chemin possible que celui que vous dessinez ce matin.
There's one issue that three elder boys like us should also talk on, and that's we have to include much more women in what is done. Women are more inclusive, women are ecologically more aware, and yet they are not mainstream part of the decision processes. So a feminization of research, of teaching, is a very important part of it. By the way, this is one of the strongest elements I have seen at OCP. Nearly 50% of the management position there are already women. If you look at Volkswagen or BASF or at Novartis, it is much less. So, you know, also let's look at the different abilities human beings have, and let's use them according to their strengths. And so that obviously, and it's not the usual gender debate, it is just using the ability to perceive problems differently that women have apart from men. And it's not either or, it is as well as that also is part of sustainable development. It's also not leaving them behind.
Un mot, Daniel.
Le dernier, parce que je voudrais faire le lien avec Smulders,
Oui.
qui a parlé du cadmium. Et Smulders a été beaucoup moins inquiétant que ce que les pseudo-scientifiques font valoir pour les sols. Là, tu viens de voir une conférence, malheureusement tout n'était pas lisible, mais enfin bon, j'ai essayé d'être compréhensif. Les sols sont en danger, mais ils ne sont pas en danger avec le cadmium et tout ça. Ouais. Ils sont en danger pour le sol lui-même. C'est pas... Alors, on peut faire des kilomètres et écrire des pages et des pages sur le cadmium, sur ci, sur ça. Mais quel est le vrai problème? C'est d'arrêter l'érosion des sols. C'est pas grave, il faut nourrir les gens. Et c'est pas le peu de cadmium qu'il y aura qui vont créer le problème. C'est qu'il n'y aura plus de sol, c'est ça le problème. Donc il faut changer de pratique agricole. Et après, quand on aura le temps, eh ben, on s'occupera du cadmium, on s'occupera de ceci et de cela dans le sol. Mais c'est d'abord conserver les sols pour nourrir les hommes et les femmes.
Quel beau chantier. Il faut l'entreprendre le plus vite possible. Merci, merci beaucoup, messieurs. Merci infiniment. C'était passionnant. Alors, on va rester, je vous en prie, si vous voulez bien rejoindre la salle, on va rester un peu sur la même problématique. Je vais demander maintenant à M. Chapaguin de bien vouloir prendre la parole, mais sur un thème tout à fait passionnant qui est évidemment lié à la question de l'eau. Comment la gestion de l'eau aujourd'hui peut nous aider, au fond, à améliorer la gestion des sols et donc répondre de façon plus efficace aux questions de l'alimentation mondiale pour éviter la famine. Et bienvenue à vous. Monsieur Chapaguin, dont vous voyez maintenant la présentation ici même. Je vous en prie, monsieur. Bienvenue à vous.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. My name is Ashok Chapaguin. Let me bring the slides. How do I do it? Just press it like this? Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I work for Pacific Institute CEO Water Mandate and also work for University of Free State as a professor. I used to be working with the Water Footprint Network in the Netherlands for the last couple of years since it started in 2008. So here today I am presenting one small concept, water footprint. What is it? How do we understand water footprint of humanity and what we can do about it? The earlier speakers, they very rightly said very, very crucial things about science, like science has to be accessible by common people. Science should be understood by citizens, our grandchildren. Otherwise, it just gets locked into library bookshelves, and then it's of no use, no matter how high impact factors the journals you publish has high impact factors and other things. It has to be accessible. And today I try to be more accessible. I try to present the things in a way we can understand, and hopefully I can make a case. And I have a couple of questions for you to answer or think about when you leave the conference or the round tables and go back home and then ponder about that. Like we all discussed about climate change and the impact of climate change, and it has different impacts in different locations. If you look into this picture, this is the precipitation that's going to change in In a couple of years' time, if we continue to go in the line that we are leading with the consumption of fossil fuel and all the greenhouse gas emission, we might have more rainfall in the locations where we already have extreme rainfall, and we might have less rainfall in locations where we have less rainfall. So situation is going to get more, I would say, dirty, I would say risky, and I would say infeasible for humanity to survive for longer duration. This is the picture of humanity's water footprint. If you look into the picture, you can see blue water scarcity. Blue water is the water that you can touch it, feel it from the grounds and the lakes and then in the rivers, in the taps. And that's the scarcity of the water. Blue water scarcity is not available for immediate use. So how much blue water is available with respect to how much we consume, the ratio of that is the scarcity. So if you consume everything that is available, then you are 100% under scarcity. So sometimes you see that some of the locations are quite red, meaning that it's under blue water scarcity most of the time, most of the year. So almost 4 billion people are facing severe water scarcity during at least 1 month in a year. Sometimes we think that we have plenty of water. I come from Nepal, where we have plenty of water, but other times we don't have a single drop of water in our tap. So the average doesn't make any sense. It has to be a continuous supply of water for drinking matter, unless you have some other measures to make sure that you get those waters in the times of scarcity. So if I move to Africa, this is more important because Professor Nahon earlier said that most of the soil that we have is in Africa. And if you look into this picture, the northern part of Africa, it already is very water scarce, very red region. And it's the middle belt of Africa is bit more green, meaning that it has low blue water scarcity. It might have hundreds of reasons behind that. It could be because there is no use right now, so there is no scarcity currently. But it could be that they might have more rainfall in that region. So you need to look into the bigger picture. Let me pause for a moment and then just try to see the connections. If you look into this small location where we can immediately see there is a rainfall, movement of clouds, and then there is evaporation, and it's all you can see, you can feel it. So it's easy to understand. So the connection here is the rainfall that goes through the river, and that the soil is carried by the water, and then that goes to the field and the rivers, and then the cycle is very easy to visualize. We have seen this hundreds of times. So it's easy to discuss those things. But just pause for a moment again. The connection goes beyond that small location. For example, I would say water connection connects everything. I live in the UK nowadays, and then we consume strawberries from Spain. And in Spain, we use lots of water to produce the tomatoes that we consume in the UK, for example. So what happens in Spain also impacts the UK or the other way around. How much tomatoes we consume in the UK would also impact what happens in the Almeria region. So it's all connected. There are other reasons why this connection is there because of the global trade, the economic gains, and then businesses. This is making a system running because of the global connection and the trade. So the environmental problems that you have in Spain, for example, all the plastic houses, you can see that, all the degradation, that's also one of the impacts of the consumption in the UK. I wouldn't say that all the impacts are negative impacts. The money that is generated because of this trade is also helpful for the people in Almeria, but we need to understand what are our implications of our consumption, I would say footprints of our consumption. So the couple of slides, strawberries in farmers' land, and then the dry land that's related to the consumption in the supermarket shelves, the fresh and juicy strawberry that we eat this morning, all of the times. So these are all connected. The drying rivers, for example, in Andalusia, in Spain, these are connected. And not only the quantity of water, but also the pollution generated by this kind of production and consumption cycles. And then also the mining and then the flooding problems, everything is connected. So the local hydrology that we could see earlier, the rainfall and then the river flows and evaporation, is just a small cycle. The bigger cycle is the global cycle that brings about the changes in the local system. So I do decide here to consume lots of water-intensive products that might have impact somewhere else. So the earlier example about the butterfly effect is very good here. I mean, it's very difficult to understand. That's the reason I say we need to make science accessible by the children, grandchildren, and our kids and in the society. Only then meaningful changes can happen. We cannot always blame the politicians. The politicians are the reflections of us. So we need to make sure that our children can understand the science in a manner our granddad, our grandparents tell the stories to them. So we need to make sure that science is accessible. So if I move to the next slide, can I go to the back one? Professor Tony Allen, he started this concept, virtual water, in early 90s. He said the amount of water used to produce a certain product, that is the virtual water contained in the product. When you hold a gram of almond in your hand, it's just a gram of almond in your hand, but it's hundreds of liters of water that goes into making of that almond. Professor Tony Allen, 1937-2021, he was my professor when I did my PhD in the Netherlands, and together with Professor R.N. Hoekstra, he was an innovative thinker, and you just want to understand, know that when he submitted his article to get published in a scientific journal first time about virtual water, it was rejected in 1990s. And then after 20 years of hard work by the scientists, we made it kind of general mainstream science, which can be understood by the policy makers at the same time by the research scientists. And Professor R.N. Hoekstra, who started this concept of water footprint, he also sadly passed away a couple of years back. He started this water footprint network in 2008, and I'm his first PhD student in the Netherlands, so I have great respect for the man who created water footprint concept in the first place. So the water footprint that he started, I wouldn't go into detail how water footprint moved into the scientific debate and then the policy arena. It's a long story short. What is water footprint assessment then? So we know there is a concept, water footprint, and what is the water footprint assessment? It's about understanding the quantity and quality of different kinds of water, the water footprints. I will come to the different kinds of water in a couple of minutes. I have plenty of time today. I see that in the agenda, 40 minutes. That's a lot of time for me to explain my concept, the concept of water footprint, and evaluate how you evaluate your footprints, how you assess it, I mean, whether it's good or bad, or whether it's useful or helpful or not, and then take the action, meaningful action, and you could formulate water strategies. So it's understanding the footprints is to understand where water is important to business and governments and how production and consumption impact the water resources. For example, the consumption of the tomatoes in the UK, the example that I gave you earlier, if something needs to be done in Spain, who is going to take the initiation? What are the actions that we need to take? I need to feel the pain as a consumer that I wouldn't get any more of those tomatoes. Then I would know the true value of the tomatoes. Like one of the speakers earlier said, the value expressed in dollars and euros are not the true value of the product we consume. So we need to make sure the science explains the true value of the products that we consume. We need to be aware of that. So that's the starting point. We cannot keep on talking about rocket science when the problem is in our hands, and we should be able to explain that to the general consumer. So there are 4 steps, like all the problem-solving exercise. You need to set the goals and the scope, and then you need to account. Unless you can measure things, you cannot tackle it. You need to have the idea of what it is, what is your footprint, and then you need to do whether that is sustainable or not. The sustainable thing, I would come in my last slide. There are some questions around sustainability that I want to ask you. And then finally, you need to formulate a response. There are 4 phases in water footprint assessment. Now, I want to go back and make some of the smaller slides. When I came to the UK for the first time in 2007 as a PhD student, just finished kind of postgraduate, kind of entry-level scientist, I had a chance to speak to the chief scientific advisor of the UK, and he asked me in the corridors, what is it? What do you mean by water footprint? So I needed to make sure that over the cup of coffee, he understands that. He's the chief scientific advisor. He could understand anything that a serious scientist could tell. But I gave him this example. The bread that we're taking right now would take about 40 liters of water for a slice of bread. The tea that the people are having right now, or the ice, or the sugar, they take so much of water. 180 liters of water in a brace for one tomato. So you can just see these things and then just think about the amount of water that you consume indirectly. I give this example all the times. A latte, for example, would have coffee in it, would have milk in it, sugar and water, cup and lid and wrapper. So it's not only one cup of coffee, it has so many other ingredients. Just try to think about them. It also takes energy to produce that cup of coffee. And then if I go back into how much water would it takes about 148 liters of water to make that cup of coffee. Now, when we try to make things simple, it's easy to forget, because that 140 liters of water is not all bad or all good, because that 208 liters for the latte actually. Sugar, whether it's sugar beet or sugar cane. Milk, whether it is from rain-fed or supplement feed. So the cow is from the rain-fed agriculture, the grass that is fed to the cow is from rain-fed agriculture or from supplement feed. Or the coffee itself, is it green water from the rainfall, or is it from the blue water, or is it a water scarce region? So the number 208 is very good for raising awareness, but we need to be very careful that that's not the holy mantra. We need to be able to explain the deeper stories behind these numbers. So the three components of water footprint that I said earlier are green water footprint, blue water footprint, and gray water footprint. Green water footprint is about the consumption of the rainfall that evaporates when you grow crops, for example, so rain-fed agriculture. Blue water footprint is the volume of surface of groundwater or the water from lakes and then rivers that is evaporated when you make the products. The gray water footprint is a very interesting concept. It's about if you pollute a river, for example, if you drop a drop of poison in a river, it pollutes hundreds and thousands of liters of water such that you cannot use it. That's an extreme example. But if you discharge wastewater to river stream, it might pollute to a certain extent. So the amount of water needed to assimilate or digest the pollutant load that you release to the environment is the grey water footprint. If you do not have that water in the stream, then your remaining water wouldn't be feasible to be used for other purposes downstream. So I wouldn't go into the deeper of this number, but one coffee bean might have gone through the production process whereby you have different kinds of products and byproducts. In the product cycle, they would have different water footprint. So it could be a very complex process. But at the end of the day, I could tell Professor, our Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor John Beddington, that it's 140 liters of water, that's for black coffee that you are drinking right now. And he could take that very easily. And that very next day, he was flying to Japan for the tsunami, bigger disaster to attend that conference. But he still remember this number, 140 liters of water. So we need to make sure that science is understood by the politicians, policy makers, and also our grandchildren. So I wouldn't explain this one. This one is a very simple slide. It wouldn't take a long time. It's the UK's water footprint elsewhere. So how much water we import from this region and consume in the UK, or our footprints in other parts of the world. So the connection I want to make in this discussion this morning is about globalization. In earlier slide, the first slide, I was reading Guardian this morning, and then I saw the numbers again in the presentation earlier about the war in Ukraine is kind of breaking down the cycle, global cycle of wheat supply chain from Ukraine, which is producing majority of the wheat that is consumed elsewhere in the world. If that is broken, then there is wheat scarcity in the world. So there is a problem with the globalization, but there is benefit also. I will come to that a bit later. So in a country, for example, national water accounting, like the budget of a country, How much water do you need to produce goods and services? The column, blue column. Part of that is consumed in a country itself. Part of that is exported to make money from other countries, for example. So it's the international trade. So the total water used in a country for production is two parts: consumption within the country, export outside the country. We also import goods and services from other countries that would need water in those countries. So my national water budget is total water in production and import. That's my budget, and then I consume part of it, I export part of it. Meaning that my budget is not only the production, water put within the nation. If we try to make our national water policy just based on how much water we have in-house, it's gonna fail eventually, or it's not a good policy, I would say. You need to see the balances. Some of the countries are greener, meaning that some countries import more than they export. Some countries are exporting more than they import. The dilemma is that some of the water-scarce countries are exporting more. You see the middle belt, Mediterranean region and the Europe, they are exporting more. So if you look into this graph, when I said science has to be accessible, I cannot make it more accessible. It's a bit kind of a messy chart. Along the x-axis, it's the meter cube of water per capita per annum available in a country, meaning that the further, like 5,000 meter cube per capita per annum, the country is very water rich with respect to their resources and the less population probably. They wouldn't import a lot of wheat, cereal import from other countries. If it falls below 1,000 meter cube per capita per annum, then the country seriously starts to import from outside. Before we reach there, we can start formulating our policies such that the food scarcity doesn't escalate further down the line. So it's getting ready for this eventuality. I would skip this slide. When we try to understand the water footprint of a supply chain, for example, the coffee beans that I said earlier, or maybe the tomatoes, maybe the sugar cane, or the Coca-Cola that I drank this morning, a can of Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. I wouldn't name one single company, but the beverage company, for example. One of the major supplier of drink beverage, for example, Coca-Cola in Europe, they import sugar from 14 countries, and they have sugarcane farms all over the world. So if you look into this global distribution of suppliers, it's spread all over the world. So if I ask the company to be responsible and start having meaningful action taken in those locations, it's not really practical to start in all those places because it's spread all over the world. So we need to make sure that, they can start where it's more impactful. So they need to prioritize. They need to see whether their footprints in the global supply chain are sustainable or not in those locations, how much of their footprint are located in those locations, so they can start prioritizing their action. In the prioritization exercise, we found that the sugar that they import, for the can of sugar, the Coca-Cola or the Pepsi-Cola that I have in my hand, they import from 277 river basin. We could prioritize based on their footprint to a very limited number of river basins. And then further prioritization could be regions, priority regions where they can find other actors also acting in the field. Then you can think about, as a company, is internal action sufficient? They can improve their footprint, they can make it more sustainable or less harmful to the environment. Or do you need to work with external parties for collective action? If yes, then what kind of external parties you're thinking about? This is a decision-making tree. This is one of the decision-making trees that you could have. You could ask the water footprint, the amount of water that you need to produce that kilogram of sugar in that location exceeds the benchmark. Do you take more or less than the general average water footprint of the production in that region? And if that is in a hot spot, if it is in a location where it is very very scarcity, water scarcity is very high or not. So in this way, having kind of decision tree, you could land in regions where your water footprint could be harmful to the environment and you can have meaningful action. With that slide, I come to the next page of my presentation where I would show where are my research focus right now. I would say water-based economy, that's in the y-axis, and water footprint, the volume of water used and deteriorated in quality in x-axis. I would say we can keep on growing with respect to economic growth, water-based economic, up to a certain point. After a point, if you keep on increasing your water footprint in that region, you might have negative implications, so you might go down. So you cannot perpetually increase your water footprint to grow your business or your economy. So there is a limit to growth with respect to water. And then if you think about improving efficiency, so I improve the efficiency of irrigation, so I can produce more sugar using less water, but there is a limit. You cannot keep on increasing efficiency, and then it also goes to the limit to growth with respect to efficiency. And finally, I want to import from the region where they can produce more efficiently. So in one region, I cannot produce more efficiently, so I import it from somewhere else. Because of the local condition, they might be producing more efficiently. So you can increase global efficiency, but there is also a limit. So these are all limits to growth with respect to water economy. So you cannot keep on doing that. So we know we are under limited resources. This is fair water footprint by 2030, an initiative we launched in COP26 just recently. By 2030, we wanted to make sure that humanity have fair water footprints everywhere in the world. I wouldn't go into detail of this. You can go to the website of fair water footprint and then see what does it mean, how you can participate, and then be part of it. And this is one of the key slides. This is the vulnerability of European economy to hydrological extremes and outside its border. For example, if something happens in Brazil, extreme happens in Brazil, that would impact the European economy. Now it doesn't have to be Brazil, it's in Ukraine now itself. If something happens in Ukraine and the supply chain breaks down, your economy would be disrupted. So there is a connection there. So the bigger question that I started in the beginning is about how resilient you are. So science is always looking towards purity, making things perfect. But we can survive being less perfect as well. That's my point. You can be resilient by being less perfect. For example, if you become more efficient, highest efficiency you can gain, you produce things to the extreme. For example, Netherlands, they have the dikes to stop the flood water. And all around their smaller villages, towns, they have dikes for highest flood level they can possibly imagine. Let's say 1,250 years return period flood, 5,000 years return period flood. And you keep on raising the height of the dikes, embankments, such that there is less risk by the side of the dikes. Meaning that your economy grows to the level, the risk becomes higher and higher. There is no room to grow anymore. So it's a lock-up situation. The more you try to invest in one direction, in the quest of becoming perfect, you are failing miserably. I would say the system becomes gains highest efficiency, but it becomes very brittle. It can break, and then you can have no point of return. So you have to be very careful about becoming more efficient as well. So you need to have flexibility in it. You need to have adaptability in the system. You need to have robustness in the system. You need to be inclusive, and the system has to be just and equitable. So I would say these are the 6 characteristics of resilience. That's what I am doing right now. What are the 6 characteristics of the resilience? So in conclusion, the water footprint assessment would help us save water via trade, but increases dependency on the other countries to get water. We have this example of Ukraine again. I would have given another example if it was not Ukraine this week, so I cannot avoid giving that example. And local consumption have global impacts. So for discussion, or maybe for you to ponder over a glass of water or the cup of coffee in your hands, from the national perspective, is import of water in virtual form, meaning that in products, a solution for water scarce country? If a country is water scarce, for example, Jordan imports more than 80% of its food from outside. That's a policy taken without knowing about the water implication. They cannot produce food. Japan imports lots of maize from the USA. There are positive sides to it because USA has a corn belt and they can produce corn easily, and Japan doesn't have favorable conditions to grow corn. So it happens. So you can save your water scarcity similarly. If a region is kind of having problem getting drinking water, you can rely on your very scarce commodity for drinking or other very important aspect. You cannot import those water from outside. Then you can import your water-intensive goods and product from outside. The downside is you become water dependent, and then you can be held against your will in the times of crisis, like UK having gas pipelines from Russia, and if Russia decides not to send those gas to the UK, I am already paying my gas bills higher than I could imagine. So there is a downside to it. From global perspective, is virtual water trade is a mechanism to avoid global water crisis, meaning that food crisis is associated with the global water crisis. So can we do that? Or are we simply shifting problem from one region to the other region? So where is the mechanism to have the global collaboration? Who is going to monitor United Nations? I would see, I have doubts about that, given the recent example. Probably they have different ideas, but the ongoing crisis and the role of the United Nations is questionable in some extent. From the consumer perspective, I can make a change myself. Professor Arjen Hoekstra, late Professor Arjen Hoekstra, he used to eat meat, beef a lot. I also eat meat. I don't eat beef, but I eat lamb. He changed his habit and he stopped eating meat because he see the environmental implications of eating meat. So a change you need to have from within you when you ask your children to change themselves. So you need to be the example you want to see in the world. So Professor Arjen Hoekstra was great in that respect. And with that thought, I leave it here, but I am open to questions if you have any, and you can reach me in my email address or follow me in my Twitter handle. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Chapagan. Je regarde l'heure. Il va falloir malheureusement qu'on avance parce que sinon on n'y arrivera pas. Mais vous restez avec nous quand même cet après-midi parce que je pense qu'on pourra revenir sur tous les points que vous avez mis en perspective s'agissant de cet enjeu premier de l'eau, bien sûr, et de sa gestion. Mais on en apprend beaucoup. J'imaginais pas qu'il y avait autant de choses dans une tasse de café. Merci à vous.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Nous avons plusieurs fois évoqué depuis hier matin l'enjeu du modèle, enfin si on peut parler de modèle en l'occurrence, du modèle économique et de ses possibles, voire nécessaires transitions. Moi je vous propose de réfléchir maintenant à la façon dont nous pourrions modifier notre système alimentaire pour nourrir la planète. Et pour cela, nous allons entendre Ismaël El-Ouafi qui, au passage, et ça n'est pas anodin, a été élue pour l'année 2016 la femme de l'année pour ses travaux en sciences. Et vous avez vu à quel point on a insisté il y a un instant sur cet enjeu de la communication scientifique, d'une forme de pédagogie et de rendre accessibles des questions qui sont parfois un peu complexes, mais qu'il est toujours possible d'expliquer et de rendre accessible au plus grand nombre. Madame El-Ouafi va nous rejoindre. Welcome to you. You hear me?
Oui, je vous entends très bien, Stéphane. Bonjour.
Formidable. Bonjour et bienvenue à vous.
Bonjour à tout le monde et bien désolé que je ne suis pas avec vous en personne.
Oui, nous aussi, on aimerait que vous soyez là. Mais on va vous écouter, madame, je vous en prie.
Exactement, merci beaucoup. J'espère que les collègues vont pouvoir mettre les slides. Si on a commencé avec les slides, je pourrais je pourrais commencer ma présentation, comme vous avez dit, sur la transformation des systèmes alimentaires. So do we have the slides, colleagues? Can I start?
Est-ce que le PowerPoint est prêt? Est-ce qu'on peut le lancer?
Est-ce qu'on peut la projeter? Comme ça, je peux commencer ma présentation. Et encore, Stéphane, c'est bien dommage que je ne peux pas être avec vous maintenant, mais vraiment, ça fait presque 2 ans que je suis en train de discuter avec Daniel, les tables rondes, et que je suis vraiment contente d'être une nouvelle personne qui se rajoute à votre liste d'experts pour discuter vraiment des sujets de fond.
Et vous êtes vraiment la bienvenue. Peut-être avez-vous entendu Daniel tout à l'heure insister sur la nécessité première aujourd'hui de rendre la science infiniment plus accessible. Et des lieux comme cette université magnifique et d'autres dans le monde ont évidemment un rôle très très important à jouer dans ce domaine. Et ce rôle, vous l'avez si bien tenu qu'encore une fois, vous avez été célébrée comme la femme de l'année en 2016 pour cette action de communication scientifique. Alors, est-ce que le PowerPoint est prêt ou pas?
Oui, je l'ai vu sur l'écran.
Ah bah c'est parfait, je vous en prie.
Je suis désolée, je vais tourner vers l'onglet pour faire cette présentation. Et le titre de la présentation, Can transforming our agri-food system feed the world? So the idea is, what does it mean, a transformation? And what are the challenges that we have ahead of us? And where is the path towards a better future for all of us? If I can have the second slide, please. And here in this slide, what I want to show is that way before COVID-19 pandemic, we were already not on track to meet our commitment to end world hunger and malnutrition in all its form by 2030. Now with the pandemic, and we have been 2 years in it, the challenges are much more significant. So one of the key questions posed in this in the last few years is, how did we get that far? How did we get to this critical point? And based on many in-depth analysis, particularly in the SOFA reports that are done with FAO, IFAD, and few other colleagues, is that there are 4 major drivers that undermine food security and nutrition around the world, that has been exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic. These major drivers are negatively affecting food security and nutrition by creating multiple compounding impact throughout our agri-food systems. So we have some drivers that are within the system, the food system, and we have drivers that they are not within the system. So if I want to talk about drivers that are external to the food system per se, these are conflict, for example, climate variability and extremes, economic slowdown and downturns. And all of these are increasing in intensity, but are also increasing in frequency, and more frequently they are happening together. So there's a combination of challenges. And their negative impact on food security and nutrition security are made worse by high and persistent levels of inequality. So we have to recognize the issue in terms of inequality, be it between women and men, and we are in the week of the Women's Day, or between rural and urban, or between certain countries, and so on and so forth, north and south. So the other drivers are internal to the food system. For example, low productivity, inefficient food supply chain that are pushing up the cost of nutritious foods, which combined with the low income are increasing the unaffordability of the healthy diet, particularly in countries that are really affected by many of those drivers. If I can have the next slide, please. So, and within that, we cannot anymore really turn a blind eye on many things that are happening. On one hand, we have a huge deforestation. In total, the rate of deforestation has been reduced since the 1990s. But still, we can't compare a new forest with a forest that is 100 years or 1,000 years old. So we have to know that the carbon sequestration capability are different. So we need to reduce domestically deforestation and continue the path that we have in the 90s. The second one, it's biodiversity loss. Again, there, and I have a few slides more on biodiversity later to really dig into detail. The overfishing. There is a number of things that we are taking for granted and that we need dramatically to change. Next slide, please. So for FAO, it is very important for us. Our mandate is for the 194 countries that we serve, but we have a particular interest in the least and middle income countries, and particularly the least income countries. And one of the indicators that we use, it's an indicator on undernourishment. We call it, it's a monitor for hunger, that is the prevalence of undernourishment in the world. So the latest report that we had in 2021 estimates shows that we have about 720 to 811 million more people just between 2019 and 2020. So, and this year we had to present the data in a range instead of having exactly a number. And the reason behind it really the uncertainty in terms of gathering data in 2020 in our surveys. So when we look at the prevalence of the undernourishment, it has increased by about 1.5% in just 1 year, 2019 to 2020. We are just now looking, we are preparing the report for 2021, and most probably the number is going to increase more. So having only in one single year, 161 million more people that are going undernourished, it's huge. If I can have the next, please, the next slide. So in addition to that, the 720 to the 811 million people that are undernourished, we have a huge number of kids that are in stunting. So we have about 49 million stunting kids. We have 45 million that are kids that are wasted, and 39 million that are overweighted. We have people, again, 2.4 billion number, people affected by moderated to severe food insecurity. And we have about 3 billion people that are unable to afford a healthy diet. So the numbers are striking. And that's why I wanted really to put in perspective that one of the major issues we have, it's really malnutrition. It's really malnutrition, inequality, food insecurity. And if you look at the 3 billion people, if I can have the next slide, please. If you look at the 3 billion people that are that cannot afford basically a healthy diet, most of them are in our continent, in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So the next slide is, how could we really ensure a better food security for all kids, including this beautiful kid that really deserve to have a better life or a better future? If I can have another slide, please, the next slide. So I want to move to another challenge. So I give you a bit of a numbers around food security and nutrition security issues. I want to move to really what's happening in terms of climate change and how big is the challenge we have. And here, talking about science, as you mentioned, Stefan and Danielle was looking at it, we had really a buildup of evidence, of very strong scientific evidence, that what's happening in climate change, it's beyond any organization, it's beyond the country. It's really, since the report we had in 2018 on the global warming of 1.5 degree, we had a series of IPCC reports that all showed how climate change is beyond a turning point in many ways. And the latest reports that we got a few months ago in 2021, which is the IWG06, it's really a dramatic report. If I can get the next slide, please. And there is a new report that came up just last week that has also that showed more information. So if we look at what are really the state of climate, so the current state is, it says very clearly that human influence on climate change and on the warming of the atmosphere, on the ocean and on the land, it's really widespread and it's very rapid. And the report actually showed us that, for example, in terms of concentration of carbon dioxide emission, it is unmatched for the last 2 million years. So we got to a point where we never got these numbers 2 million years ago. For the last 2 million years, this is the highest. If we look at the glacial retreat, it is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. If we look at the temperature per se, we know now that the last 10 years have been hotter than any period in the last 100,000 years. We will look at the ocean warming again. So the report brought up really the timeline concept. It gave us really data, and that was what was shocking in the report, is that, for example, the sea level rise faster now than the past 3,000 years. So the human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. And that also was a very good point in this report this year, is that it was interactive and it gives you also granularity at a regional level, country level, and sometimes even county level. And when we look at the agriculture, so what's the contribution of the agri-food system to climate change? There, it shows us that we have the atmospheric concentration of methane, which is one of the major issues when we talk about greenhouse gas from agriculture, as well as atmospheric concentration from the nitrogen. And the reports give the best estimate of equilibrium climate sensitivities of 3 degrees with a narrower range compared to the AR5. So AR6 built up on AR5 and gave us all these very more precise, let's see, data and more precise estimation. Can I have the next slide, please? So how this really will affect agri-food system and how agri-food system needs to transform itself as a part of the solution, not 30% emitter of the issues of greenhouse gas. So the global surface temperature, we know now that will continue to increase until at least 2050, and they're all scenarios. So we are talking about 1.5, we are talking about 2 degrees, 4 or 6. Even if we go to the lowest, we still will have an increase till 2050. Many changes in the climate system include increase in the frequency and intensity of hot extreme, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, agriculture and ecological drought in some region, and proportion of intense tropical cyclone. It's really quite projected. And there is also a reduction in the Arctic Sea, ice, snow cover, and permafrost. So let me maybe move to the agri-food system and what's the impact, what's the implication? There is an implication on the crop production per se. There will be impact on crop productivity through model climate changes. For example, a shift in the cropping variety planted. There will be seasonal changes, for example, warming trends, extending growing season, extreme event at a high temperature affecting critical growth period, flooding, drought. I always say, for example, Africa a few years ago moved too much towards maize. Maize is a crop that has high sustainability at the flowering stage. And 2 degrees more in Africa will make that more than 50% of maize wouldn't actually produce anything because it's going to fail at the flowering stage. So temperature, it's a huge problem, and having the right crops and maybe breeding the right crops for the climate of tomorrow, it's very, very important. On the livestock production, livestock systems are impacted by climate change, mainly through increasing temperature again and precipitation variation. Temperature affects most of the critical factors of livestock production, such as water availability, animal production, reproduction, animal health, mostly through heat stress. And within that perspective, the livestock diseases are most affected and zoonosis issues with climate change going to be quite increasing. So again, another huge area that needs really to take in consideration the new data and kind of reinvent in itself to reduce both the methane and also have more sustainable and more resilient systems. And finally, for the fisheries and the aquaculture, the projected impact on fisheries and aquaculture are super negative on the global scale, particularly in certain regions. Major impacts include displacement of stock, and for aquaculture, mortality of the shellfish from acidic water. Aquaculture may be affected through reduced catch and feed fish as well, and increasing severity of tropical storm and of flooding. And we got as well huge issues when we look at food safety and high risk of livelihoods. May I have please the next slide? And basically what I want to say by that is that the climate change is changing and changing dramatically. under all scenarios. Next slide, please. And what I want to remind you is that climate change, it's also causing a lot of migration. So many of the walls after the fact, when we analyze it, and that was one of the cases in Syria, is that you find an undermining climate change impact that might have accelerate the event. Next slide, please. And let me bring in, so I talked about first the food security and nutrition. I moved to the big challenge we have ahead of us with climate change. Now I wanna give you a bit more of what I think on the biodiversity. I think biodiversity lost, it's gaining increasing attention worldwide. And I think really COP15 in China last year again brought it back. There are several assessments like exactly with the IPCC. The IPBES also build up a lot of assessment and a lot of scientific evidence to tell us that the loss of biodiversity is huge, and that the loss of diversity we transfer, it's huge, and it's affecting our productivity, it's affecting our agriculture system, fisheries, forestries, and that we need to move towards a more sustainable future. So in spite of these many studies and assessment on biodiversity, we know very little of biodiversity. I always say we know really the tip of the iceberg. So we think that we know most of the species, but the reality of things is that there is a huge unknowns when we talk about oceans, for example, when we talk about microorganisms in the soil, for example. There are many, many areas where it is very important for us to really recognize that we need more information so that we do more research in terms of biodiversity. If I can have the next slide. So the next slide, the biodiversity at all levels shows signs of decline. So both at the ecosystem level, as you see here in the slide, but also at the global forest area that we mentioned before that continues to decline. And at also, if I can get this next slide, at the genetic level as well. So at the genetic level, we need to know more on the status of varieties, breeds, strains of wild population and subspecies in general. We know, however, that 7,092 local breeds of domesticated animal, for example, in 2021, are at risk of extinction. And I don't need really to preach the importance of biodiversity for this group, but really biodiversity supports food security and nutrition, human health, and then in almost all economic sectors. I always talk biodiversity in plant is very important in animal, but even biodiversity in terms of culture, in terms of language, all of this makes the life beautiful. So if I get the next slide, I want to just show with you here how the soil biota is very important. So if you look at the soil, and I said that's one of the areas where we know very little, we tend to measure what we see, and we tend to forget about what we don't see. So the living communities above ground are very much connected with the communities below ground. And I was very happy in my time at ICPA, I put in place a soil museum to really showcase how the soil is a living organism and how it's not really what you see only, it's beyond that. And here what I want to show you, it's really what the soil food web organism is. So on the right side, you could see that what we want to see here is what we want to convey as a message is foraging activities in the debris food web, and you see them with thin white arrows, stimulate nutrient renewal, which is the thick red arrows, plant nutrient acquisition, and plant yield, and thus indirectly influence herbivores on the surface. So if you look at the left side, which is on the soil biota, you will see that the soil biota exerts direct effect on plant by feeding on the roots and forming antagonistic or mutualistic relationship with their host plants. And these direct interaction with plants influence not only the performance of the host plants, but also the herbivores and potentially the predators that eat the herbivores. So the message here is that the soil food web can control the successional development of plant communities, both directly and indirectly, and these changes in the plant community can in turn influence the soil biota. So this is just to give you an idea of really the importance of biodiversity, including biodiversity in the soil, and I could say the same thing under the water as well. The next slide, please. So basically, let me move from the problems. I'm sorry if the problems were too heavy, but from the problems, we are moving to really the hope. And there is a revolution of science and technology. We are really looking at the best time in our life when we think about science and technology. So if I can have the next slide. There is an enormous revolution in both science and technology, and it is moving at incredible speed. And I'm going to give you some numbers to put it in perspective. Next slide, please. So out of our machines and our softwares, there emerge a new intelligence, and that's what we call artificial intelligence. If I could have the next slide. And veut ou veut pas, artificial intelligence, it's impacting all of us. And it's impacting all sectors. There is no sector that doesn't work with data. There is no sectors that doesn't work with knowledge. And artificial intelligence, it's really giving us a completely different perspective on all of this. Next slide, please. So if we look at the AI, the artificial intelligence revolution versus the industrial revolution, so what McKinsey Global Institute report said is that artificial intelligence is contributing to a transformation of society that is happening 10 times faster and at 300 times the scale, or roughly 3,000 times the impact of the industrial revolution. So it's completely different way of transforming the future, or transforming the reality now and the future. Next slide, please. So imagine how this is gonna really completely change when we will master quantum computing. And as a matter of fact, artificial intelligence got a huge development when we leapfrogged the quantum computing about 4 years ago. And right now, this year, we have huge development again in the quantum computing, which will allow us to move much more faster. Next, please. So different region, we need to address different problems, but we all require the best science. We all agree that all of us depend, regardless of what our context, regardless of what we want, we need really the best science to help us move forward. Next slide, please. And that's really what's happening when we think about what happens in 2021, where many meetings, many organizations got together to really ask the question that we have the presentation about today. Can transforming our agri-food system feed the world? And they think for one time, the first time ever, in my time at least, I'm sure in before, mega events aligned food security and food insecurity and put it at the same level as climate change, for example. So they all agreed and they all strengthened the need or pushed for the need of science and innovation. And all of these meetings agreed that transforming food system, it's part of the solution. Next slide, please. I had the pleasure to be a member of the scientific committee of the UN Food System Summit that happened last September in New York. And before that, we have a pre-summit in July in FAO, hosted by FAO. And in that meeting, really, we moved the discussion to a higher level. We moved from discussing food security or discussing production system or value chains to a food system level. And there in the meeting in New York, we had about 163 member states that delivered statement, and we had 77 of them delivered either by head of state and head of government, and many of them, again, stress science and innovation. If I can have the next slide, please. So if we look at what were the priorities at the country level, at the pre-summit, there was a need for sustainability. There was an emphasis on sustainability, on nutrition and diet, on agricultural production and climate change. And at the summit, the emphasis was more on the collaboration. So we understand that partnership is very important. Of course, COVID-19 was very present, but so was food security, nutrition and diet, sustainable production system, as well as certain coalitions such as the feeding, the school feeding one. If I can have the next slide. And in the next slide here, it's really looking at which statement and which countries have brought up science and innovation. And you could see that, for example, I'm trying to find which one is the science. So you find that 39 of them talked about science and technology. You find, for example, that 38 of them talked about environment, nature, and biodiversity. And I'm sure in others, there was about 40 some that talks about innovation. Next slide, please. And when we match the top priority from statement and we match it with the 5 action track of the Food System Summit, you could see that there is a huge distribution, but there is also a lot of focus on nourishing the people. Again, all kind of malnutrition, the triple burden of nutrition. But there are also many of them on nature-based solution, some of them on the resilience of the system, and so on and so forth. But in general, we got about at least 40% of the countries recognizing the need of science and innovation. And we got, as I talked earlier, the COP and the COP26 on climate change, the COP15 on biodiversity, really focusing on science and innovation and making the agri-food system as part of the solution, not the problem. So next slide, please. Just to sum up what the UN Food System Scientific Committee recommendation were. So we put forward 7 science-driven innovation that we elaborated in a paper. And here are some concrete examples. So the first recommendation was innovation to end hunger and increase availability and affordability of healthy diet and nutrition food. And this bundle partly draws on the other 6 science and innovation action. So if we look at the second one, what we were recommending, it's really to push for innovation to de-risk the food system and strengthen its resilience, in particular for negative emission farming system, drawing on advanced science and traditional knowledge. So as you know, gene editing is a new technology, and you could see we are seeing a surge of gene editing application, particularly in cattle, to reduce methane emission, but also to transform certain feed to really reduce again the methane. So this is really around de-risking the food system, particularly in certain areas, such as the livestock. The third one, it's innovation to overcome inefficient and unfair land, credit, labor, and natural resource use arrangements, and to facilitate the inclusion of the empowerment and the right of women, youth, and intellectual property. And this innovation really, it goes beyond really science and technology. It goes mostly into political or policy innovation. It goes in social innovation and in other aspects of innovation. The third one, it's biosciences and digital innovation for improving people health, enhancing system productivity, and restoring ecological well-being. And again, here, we're not talking only about digital innovation, which is very attracting a lot of attention, but also biosciences towards a healthier planet in terms of people, prosperity, and the planet per se. The fifth innovation is innovation to keep and where needed regenerate productive soils, water and landscape, and protect diversity of the agricultural genetic base and biodiversity. And again, here there was a huge push on approaches that are holistic and innovative, like agroecology, but also other regenerative agricultural systems. And the sixth innovation, it's for sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, and protection of coastal areas and ocean. And the last one, the power of engineering and digital innovation for efficiency, inclusiveness of food system, and empowerment of youth and rural communities. Next slide, please. And in the paper, we also put focus on modes of implementation that needs to especially focus on finance, capacity, and governance. Our report, our final report, and I'll be happy to share with you, it's on the website of the UN Food System Summit and the UN Food System Summit Scientific Committee. The report calls on governments, especially in least and middle income country, to review the level of their investment in food system science and allocate at least 1% of their food system related GDP to food system science and innovation, with the perspective to sustainably exceed this target. Investment in capacity for science and innovation also needs to expand, and that's where a university like UM6P is very important, not only for Morocco, but globally, particularly for Africa. And also by the end is that food system science and food system policy need a stronger framework for constructive and evidence-based interaction for moving ahead. And the report calls up on government and UN agencies to initiate a process to explore options, existing as well as new, for strengthening the global science policy interface for sustainable food system. And next slide, please. And that really takes me only for about 3-4 more slides to tell you a little bit what are we doing, actually more. It's about 6 slides. What are we doing really at FAO to really push towards a transformation of agri-food system? So our strategic framework for the next decade, so it's 22 to 31, will drive the organization effort to transform agri-food system and address hunger, poverty, and inequality over the next decade. The strategic framework focuses on 3 SDGs. SDG 1, which is ending poverty, SDG 2, which is zero hunger, and SDG 10, which is reduction of inequality, as well as supporting the broader agenda of the SDGs. Next slide, please. And what I want to really leave you with is that for me, having SDG 10 as one of the high SDGs is very important for us, because the bottom line of it, it's inequality. So we need to address it. So our strategic framework calls for 4 better. We call it a better production, a better nutrition, a better environment for a better life for all. So under better production, we want to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns through efficient and inclusive food and agriculture supply chain at the local, the regional, and global level, ensuring a resilient and sustainable agri-food system in a changing climate and environment. And the better nutrition, we want to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition in all its forms, including promoting nutritious food and increasing access to healthy diet. So affordability is very important there. And the better environment, we want to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial and marine ecosystem and combat the climate change. And this hopefully will get us to have a more efficient, more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable agri-food system. And under better life, which is really the chapeau of all these betters, it's to promote inclusive economic growth by reducing inequalities, be it, as I said earlier, urban, rural, rich, poor countries, men, women, you name it. So definitely the better life goes beyond agriculture, and that's where agri-food systems, it's the right level to discuss. Next slide, please. So to support and to operationalize our framework, FAO applies 4 cross-cutting accelerators in our programs, and those are technology, innovation, data, and complement. And what I want to say here is that for all these accelerators, because these accelerators for us will allow us to work harder, to work quicker, to get impact, to get impact and to increase the impact as well. And science, it's a basis for all of them. Science is a basis for technology, it's a basis of innovation, it's a basis of data, and also a basis for complement, because we talk even institutional innovation, for example, you need data, you need information, you need science behind it to understand what it is. And for me, sciences goes beyond biological sciences, of course, and I'm sure you agree with me, it's social sciences, it's economic sciences, and it's biological sciences. Next slide, please. And within that, it's I said it in earlier, it's really science and innovation is a foundation for everything. It's a foundation for our strategic framework and beyond that for the global development agenda. Next slide. Here again, just to showcase that really it's the basis, science, technology, and innovation, and where are the entry points. And again, because we are talking at large when we talk about science, and we talk at large when we talk about innovation, so we don't look only at technological innovation, but we look at the social innovation, financial innovation, institutional innovation, and policy innovation. And that's why science, technology, and innovation, it's really part and parcel of all the betters. And under the betters, what we have, it's what we call priority program areas. And again, they're all of them are based on science and innovation. So next slide, please. To put in place our strategic framework for the next decade, I am leading the development of FAO Science and Innovation Strategy. And the purpose really is to strengthen the use of science and innovation in FAO technical intervention and normative guidance, and particularly serve as a tool to implement the strategic framework. So if we are talking about producing more with less, we need science. If we are talking about reducing the footprint of the agri-food system, again, we are talking about science and innovation. Next slide, please. So one of the roles of my office as the new chief scientist at FAO, it's really to strengthen dialogue on science, including by developing knowledge and expertise and bring to bear the foremost science-based evidence on cross-sectorial, multidisciplinary priority issues related to agri-food system at the global level. So FAO must act as a catalyst for leveling the playing field so that countries can make evidence-based decisions. And one of the roles is really to clarify contentious issues. Contentious issues tend to divide us. And most of these contention, engaging in those issues, it's very important through right communication. And I heard Stefan talking about science communication as well earlier. It's very important. And that's really what we are trying to do out of my office. It's take those contentious issues, bring scientists from all over the world, and get them really to tell us what do we know, what we don't know. And the first one that I'm really looking at, and we have a group of scientists that are working on a reference paper, is gene editing. Not only because gene editing was the Nobel Prize last year, and one of the two scientists is French, as a matter of fact, but because it's one of the breakthroughs that's going to change really the future of the agri-food system. So we are putting together a number of scientists to tell us what do we know, what we don't know, and how could we take advantage of those technologies, such as gene editing and others. Next slide, please. What we are doing as well, it's developing what I call ATU, and the ATU stands for Agri-Food System Innovation and Technology Outlook. And the idea is really to have an outlook that comes out every year to monitor agri-food technologies and innovation. And this is one of really the roles that I see for my office as chief scientist. It's really to identify, pilot, scale innovation and technologies, and also showcase to the countries which one works better for their context, recognizing that it's particularly challenging to specific constraints because of specific constraints that are faced in different parts of the world. So what we are saying is that we have a menu of information, a menu of technologies and innovation, and some of them works better in certain organizations. Right now, we are in the midst of really developing the scope of ATU, and we had a conference or a workshop just last week to discuss it. And basically, what we are looking at, it's a flagship report, but also maybe indexes that could be developed later on to tell us what's happening in the South. The way a little bit how OECD does it for the North, whereby they are giving us information on innovation and technology in the OECD countries, we want to make it really much more larger and look how could we give that same information on all countries in the South, and how could we bring the technological with the policy, with the investment, so that we showcase that to scale up certain innovation, your problem, it's not actually investment, it's policy, or your issue has to be in engaging more private sector, also on and so forth. So this is really a new era, and we are very excited about it. And I'll move to the next slide, which actually talk about foresight and the importance of foresight. And here, what I want to inform you is that really, as part of the science and innovation strategy, we think that we don't have enough clarity of what's going to happen in the future. We don't have good strategic framework when we talk about, or a foresight framework when we talk about agri-food system. And what I am putting in place, it's a biannual exercise on foresight to really help us be prepared for alternative plausible future, and also feeding into anticipatory action, as well as convening the global community, be it the CGR centers, the ERCA centers, the academies, the universities, the farmers, to really have constructive dialogue and a little bit have more clarity of what could happen and how could we be prepared for it. And within that, what we are doing, if I can have the next slide, please. So what we are doing really, it's undertaking a study on the foresight that will allow us to understand what are the breakthroughs in technology and innovation that can change the agri-food system in the next 10 to 30 years. What would be the context-specific impact of these disruptive technologies or innovation, and how can foresight enable the identification of synergies and trades-off, and we address them, of course, and really how could we do that for all the countries, not only one or two countries. So for the foresight, for me, just to make it easier for you, to really bring it closer to you, gene editing as a technology, for example, we got a debate once the technology is out in the market. And you know what happens? Even the EU, the European Union, that says this is a GMO and you should not allow it, they are using it in their research portfolio. So all the universities are using gene editing in their research portfolio while they are having the global debate, is it a GMO or not? But what happens in the South is that the South is so much dependent of their export to Europe, particularly, that they won't use gene editing for their research. They just stop using it. And by stopping using it, what happens is that they get even further back. So we create a huge gap again. And that's really what I would like to do with this foresight, is that we bring technologies to be discussed early on. So when the technology is mature, when the technology is on the market, we use it. We don't debate it anymore. So, and that's really what I am really intending to do with this foresight exercise. It's bring the South to the same level as the North. They know what's happening. They have their sovereign right to choose to use it or not to use it. Because it is a pity, really, that the impact on the global debate around technologies affect the South more than the North, and wider the gap between the North and the South. If I can have the next slide. And the next slide is just to tell you that really, if I think there is a global agreement now that we need to change our agri-food system. And we need to change it not because only of the climate change, but because also of the malnutrition, because also of the food security issues, because of so many other things. So I don't think we are at a point where we are debating, do we need to transform it or not? It is a given. And to transform it this time, we better have decisions that are based on science and innovation and technology, that they are based on evidence. That evidence could be actually not necessarily innovative. It could be something that existed within the local communities or indigenous communities, but it has to be based on evidence, be it scientific and new, or be it cultural and old, so that the agri-food system, it's part of the solution. It's a part of the solution to slow down the climate change and to improve livelihood of everybody, particularly the farmer communities in the South, in the global South. Thank you very much, and over to you, Stefan. I think the next slide, it's a thank you slide, if I can have it as well.
Merci, Madame Elouafi. Vous avez dit une chose tout de même d'un mot, parce qu'il faut que nous concluions maintenant, mais vous avez dit la biodiversité est perdue. Et Lévi-Strauss avait dit que c'était notre chance. Donc le chantier, il est énorme, là. Hein?
Exactement. Le chantier est énorme. On doit savoir un peu plus sur la biodiversité. Et on doit vraiment ramener la biodiversité à être actif. La biodiversité, ce n'est pas les gen banks, ce n'est pas les régions qui sont juste, comment dire, qui sont protégées. La biodiversité devrait être sur notre table également. Alors moi, j'ai toujours dit, on a à peu près 500 000 plantes, espèces de plantes. Apparemment, 30 000 ont été utilisées par notre ancestors dans le passé. 7 000, ils sont documentés, ils ont été multipliés, ils ont été un petit peu utilisés dans le marché historiquement depuis que l'humain existe sur la planète. Mais maintenant, si tu pars dans le marché, tu es seulement 125 espèces. Alors, au lieu d'essayer d'aller plus vers les 500 000, on est en train d'utiliser 125 espèces seulement, ce qui est vraiment très grave. Alors, pour moi, la biodiversité devrait être utilisée. On devrait diversifier notre table. On devrait amener au moins les 7000 espèces à être utilisées dans notre jour à jour et dans notre alimentation quotidienne.
Alors, à très vite pour poursuivre le combat, comme vous dites. Merci beaucoup, en tout cas, pour votre participation. Et merci à vous tous. Nous allons aller déjeuner. Un tout petit mot pour cet après-midi, nous allons beaucoup parler des enjeux pour la santé humaine. On vient de dire, de mesurer à quel point, d'ailleurs c'était édifiant cette présentation, à quel point vraiment le travail est gigantesque. Donc la santé humaine cet après-midi, ce que j'aimerais, c'est que chacun d'entre vous comprenne que nous avons un temps qui est limité avec lequel il faut composer. Donc d'avance, merci de s'en tenir au temps qui sont impartis à chacun pour qu'on arrive à vous donner la parole. Là, ce matin, c'était quasiment impossible de trouver du temps pour prendre des questions de la salle. Or, ce qu'on a fait ensemble hier était vraiment extrêmement intéressant et enrichissant aussi. Donc j'aimerais qu'on puisse à nouveau revenir et me tourner vers vous pour que vous puissiez vous aussi intervenir et participer au débat. Très bon déjeuner et à tout à l'heure. Merci.